The Lighthouse by P.D. James. Read by Michael Jayston. Author's note. Great Britain is fortunate in the variety and beauty of her offshore islands, but the setting for this novel, Combe Island off the coast of Cornwall, will not be found among them. The island, the deplorable events which took place there, and all the characters in the story, living or dead, are entirely fictitious, existing only in that interesting psychological phenomenon, the imagination of the crime novelist. P.D. James. Prologue. Chapter 1. Commander Adam Dalgliesh was not used to being urgently summoned to non-scheduled meetings with unspecified people at inconvenient times, but usually with one purpose in common. He could be confident that somewhere there lay a dead body awaiting his attention. There were other urgent calls, other meetings, sometimes at the highest level. Dalgliesh, as a permanent ADC to the Commissioner, had a number of functions which, as they grew in number and importance, had become so ill-defined that most of his colleagues had given up trying to define them. But this meeting, called in Assistant Commissioner Harkness's office on the 7th floor of New Scotland Yard, at 10:55 on the morning of Saturday, the 23rd of October, had, from his first entry into the room, the unmistakable presaging of murder. This had nothing to do with a certain serious tension on the faces turned towards him. A departmental debacle would have caused greater concern. It was rather that unnatural death always provoked a peculiar unease, an uncomfortable realization that there were still some things that might not be susceptible to bureaucratic control. There were only 3 men awaiting him, and Dalgliesh was surprised to see Alexander Coniston of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He liked Coniston, who was one of the few eccentrics remaining in an increasingly conformist and politicized service. Coniston had acquired a reputation for crisis management. This was partly founded on his belief that there was no emergency that was not amenable to precedent or departmental regulations, but when these orthodoxies failed, he could reveal an eccentric and dangerous capacity for imaginative initiatives, which, by any bureaucratic logic, deserved to end in disaster, but never did. Dalgliesh, for whom few of the labyrinths of Westminster bureaucracy were wholly unfamiliar, had earlier decided that this dichotomy of character was inherited. Generations of Conistons had been soldiers. The foreign fields of Britain's imperialistic past were enriched by the bodies of unmemorialized victims of previous Conistons' crises management. Even his eccentric appearance reflected a personal ambiguity. Alone among his colleagues, he dressed with the careful pinstriped conformity of a civil servant of the 30s, while, with his strong bony face, mottled cheeks and hair, with the resilient waywardness of straw, he looked like a farmer. He was seated next to Dalgliesh opposite one of the wide windows. Having sat through the first 10 minutes of the present meeting with an unusual economy of words, he sat, his chair a little tilted, complacently surveying the panorama of towers and spires, lit by a transitory, unseasonable morning sun. Of the 4 men in the room, Coniston, Adam Dalgliesh, Assistant Commissioner Harkness, and a fresh-faced boy from MI5, who had been introduced as Colin Reeves, Coniston, the one most concerned with the matter in hand, had so far said the least, while Reeves, preoccupied with the effort of remembering what was being said without the humiliating expedient of being seen to take notes, hadn't yet spoken. Now Coniston stirred himself for a summing up. Murder would be the most embarrassing for us. Suicide hardly less so in the circumstances. Accidental death we could probably live with. Given the victim, there's bound to be publicity, whichever it is. But it should be manageable unless this is murder. The problem is that we haven't much time. No date has been fixed yet, but the PM would like to arrange this top-secret international get-together in early January. A good time. Parliament not sitting. Nothing much happens just after Christmas. Nothing is expected to happen. The PM seems to have set his mind on Combe. So you'll take on the case, Adam? Good. Before Dalgliesh could reply, Harkness broke in. The security rating, if it comes off, couldn't be higher. Dalgliesh thought, and even if you're in the know, which I doubt, you have no intention of telling me who will be meeting at this top-secret conference, or why. Security was always on a need-to-know basis. He could make his guesses, but had no particular curiosity. On the other hand, he was being asked to investigate a violent death, and there were things he needed to be told. Before Colin Reeves had time to realise that this was his cue to intervene, Coniston said, "All that will be taken care of course. We're not expecting problems. There was a similar situation some years ago, before your time, Harkness, when a VIP politician thought he'd like a respite from his protection officer and booked 2 weeks on Combe. The visitor stood the silence and solitude for 2 days before realising that his life was meaningless without his red boxes. I should have thought that that was the message Combe was established to convey, but he didn't get it. No, I don't think we'll be worrying our friends south of the Thames." Well, that at least was a relief. To have the security services involved was always a complication. Dalgliesh reflected that the Secret Service, like the monarchy, in yielding up its mystique in response to public enthusiasm for greater openness, seemed to have lost some of that half-ecclesiastical patina of authority bestowed on those who dealt in esoteric mysteries. Today, its head was known by name and pictured in the press. The previous head had actually written her autobiography, and its headquarters, an eccentric oriental-looking monument to modernity which dominated its stretch of the south bank of the Thames, seemed designed to attract rather than repel curiosity. To surrender mystique had its disadvantages. An organisation came to be regarded like any other bureaucracy, staffed by the same fallible human beings and liable to the same cock-ups. But he expected no problems with the Secret Service. The fact that MI5 was represented at middle-grade level suggested that this single death on an offshore island was among the least of their present concerns. He said, "I can't go inadequately briefed. You've given me nothing except who's dead, where he died, and apparently how. Tell me about the island. Where exactly is it?" Harkness was in one of his more difficult moods, his ill humour imperfectly concealed by self-importance and a tendency to verbosity. The large map on the table was a little crooked. Frowning, he aligned it more accurately with the edge of the table, pushed it towards Dalgliesh, and stabbed it with his forefinger. "It's here. Combe Island, off the coast of Cornwall, about 20 miles southwest of Lundy Island, and roughly 12 miles from the mainland. Pentworthy in this case. Newquay is the nearest large town." He looked over at Coniston. "You'd better carry on. It's more your baby than ours." Coniston spoke directly to Dalgliesh. "I'll waste a little time on the history. It explains Combe, and if you don't know it, you may start under a disadvantage. The island was owned for over 400 years by the Holcombe family, who acquired it in the 16th century, although no one seems clear exactly how. Probably a Holcombe rode out with a few armed retainers, hoisted his personal standard, and took it over. There can't have been much competition. The title was later ratified by Henry VIII, once he'd got rid of the Mediterranean pirates, who'd established it as a basis for their slave-trading raids along the Devon and Cornish coasts. After that, Combe lay more or less neglected until the 18th century, when the family began to take an interest in it, and visited occasionally to look at the bird life or spend a day picnicking. Then Gerald Holcombe, born in the late 1800s, decided to use the island for family holidays. He restored the cottages, and in 1912 built a house and additional accommodation for the staff. The family went there every summer in those heady days before the First World War. The war changed everything. The 2 elder sons were killed, one in France, the other at Gallipoli. The Holcombes are the kind of family who die in wars, not make money from them. That left only the youngest, Henry, who was consumptive and unfit for military service. Apparently, after the death of his brothers, he was oppressed by a sense of general unworthiness and had no particular wish to inherit. The money hadn't come from land, but from fortunate investments, and by the late 20s they had more or less dried up. So in 1930 he set up a charitable trust with what was left, found some wealthy supporters, and handed over the island and the property. His idea was that it should be used as a place of rest and seclusion for men in positions of responsibility who needed to get away from the rigours of their professional lives. Now, for the first time, he bent down to open his briefcase and took out a file with a security marking. Rummaging among the documents, he brought out a single sheet of paper. "I've got the exact wording here. It makes Henry Holcomb's intentions clear. For men who undertake the dangerous and arduous business of exercising high responsibility in the service of the Crown and of their country, whether in the armed forces, politics, science, industry, or the arts, and who require a restorative period of solitude, silence, and peace." Engagingly typical of its age, isn't it? No mention of women, of course. This was 1930, remember. However, the accepted convention is held to apply that the word men embraces women. They take a maximum of 5 visitors, whom they accommodate at their choice, either in the main house or in one of the stone cottages. Basically, what Combe Island offers is peace and security. In the last few decades, the latter has become probably the more important. People who want time to think can go there without their protection officers, in the knowledge that they will be safe and completely undisturbed. There's a helicopter pad for bringing them in, and the small harbour is the only possible landing place by sea. No casual visitors are ever allowed, and even mobile phones are forbidden. They wouldn't get a signal there anyway. They keep a very low profile. People who go there are generally on personal recommendation, either from a trustee or from a previous or regular visitor. You can see its advantage for the PM's purpose. Reeves blurted out, "What's wrong with Chequers?" The others turned on him the brightly interested gaze of an adult prepared to humour a precocious child. Coniston said, "Nothing. An agreeable house with, I understand, every comfort. But guests who are invited to Chequers tend to get noticed. Isn't that the purpose of their going there?" Dalgliesh asked, "How did Downing Street get to know about the island?" Coniston slid the paper back into his file. "Through one of the PM's newly ennobled chums. He went to Combe to recover from the dangerous and arduous responsibility of adding one more grocery chain to his empire, and another billion to his personal fortune." "There are some permanent staff, presumably, or do the VIPs do their own washing up?" "There's the secretary, Rupert Maycroft, previously a solicitor in Warnborough. We've had to confide in him, and of course inform the trustees that Number 10 would be grateful if some important visitors could be accommodated in early January. At present it's all very tentative, but we've asked him to make no bookings after this month. There are the usual staff, boatman, housekeeper, cook. We know something about all of them. One or two of the previous visitors have been important enough to warrant security checks. It's all been done very discreetly. There's a resident physician, Dr. Guy Staveley, and his wife, although I gather she's more off than on the island. Can't stand the boredom, apparently. Staveley's a refugee from a London general practice. Apparently he made a wrong diagnosis and a child died. So he's got himself a job where the worst that can happen is someone falling off a cliff, and he can't be blamed for that." Harkness said, "Only one resident has a criminal conviction. The boatman, Jago Tamlin, in 1998 for GBH. I gather there were mitigating circumstances, but it must have been a serious attack. He got 12 months. He's been in no trouble since." Dalgliesh asked, "When did the current visitors arrive?" "All 5 in the last week. The writer, Nathan Oliver, together with his daughter Miranda and copy editor Dennis Tremlett, came on Monday. A retired German diplomat, Dr. Raymond Speidel, ex-ambassador to Beijing, came by private yacht from France on Wednesday, and Dr. Mark Yelland, director of the Hayes Scolling Research Laboratory in the Midlands, which has been targeted by the animal liberation activists, arrived on Thursday. Maycroft will be able to put you in the picture. Harkness broke in. Better take the minimum of people, at least until you know what you're dealing with. The smaller the invasion, the better. Dalgliesh said, It will hardly be an invasion. I'm still awaiting a replacement for Tarrant, but I'll take Inspector Miskin and Sergeant Benton Smith. We can probably manage without a Socko or official photographer at this stage, but if it proves to be murder, I'll have to have reinforcements, or let the local force take over. I'll need a pathologist. I'll speak to Kynaston if I can reach him. He may be away from his lab on a case. Harkness said, That won't be necessary. We're using Edith Glenister. You know her, of course. Hasn't she retired? Coniston said, Officially 2 years ago, but she does work occasionally, mostly on sensitive overseas cases. At 65, she's probably had enough of trudging gum-booted through muddy fields with the local CID, examining decomposing bodies in ditches. Dalgliesh wondered whether this was why Professor Glenister had officially retired. He had never worked with her, but he knew her reputation. She was among the most highly regarded of women forensic pathologists, notable for an almost uncanny accuracy in assessing the time of death, for the speed and comprehensiveness of her reports, and for the clarity and authority with which she gave evidence in court. She was notable, too, for her insistence on maintaining the distinction between the functions of the pathologist and the investigating officer. Professor Glenister, he knew, would never hear details of the circumstances of the murder before examining the body, ensuring, presumably, that she came to the corpse with no preconceived ideas. He was intrigued by the prospect of working with her, and had no doubt that it was the FCO who had originally suggested using her. All the same, he would have preferred his usual forensic pathologist. He said, You're not implying that Miles Kynaston can't be trusted to keep his mouth shut? Harkness broke in. Of course not. But Cornwall is hardly his patch. Professor Glenister is stationed at present in the southwest. Anyway, Kynaston isn't available. We've checked. Dalgliesh was tempted to say, How convenient for the FCO. They certainly hadn't lost time. Harkness went on. You can pick her up at RAF St. Maughan, near Newquay, and they'll arrange a special helicopter to take the body to the mortuary she uses. She'll treat the case as urgent. You should get her report sometime tomorrow. Dalgliesh said, So Maycroft rang you as soon as possible after finding the body. I suppose he was following instructions. Harkness said, He was given a phone number, told that it was top secret, and instructed to phone the trustees if anything untoward happened on the island. He's been warned that you'll be arriving by helicopter and to expect you by early afternoon. Dalgliesh said, He'll have some difficulty explaining to his colleagues why this particular death should attract a Metropolitan Police Commander and a Detective Inspector instead of being dealt with by the local CID, but I suppose you've covered that. Harkness said, As well as we can. The Chief Constable has been put in the picture, of course. There's no point in arguing over which force should take responsibility until we know whether we've got a murder to investigate. In the meantime, they'll cooperate. If it is murder, and the island is as secure as they claim, there'll be a limited number of suspects. That should speed up the inquiry. Only someone ignorant of a murder investigation, or who had conveniently forgotten the less successful incidents of his past, could have been so misjudging. A small group of suspects, if each was intelligent and prudent enough to keep his or her counsel, and resist the fateful impulse to volunteer more than was asked, could complicate any investigation, and bedevil the prosecution. At the door, Coniston turned. The food's all right on Combe Island, I suppose? The bed's comfortable? Harkness said coolly. We've had no time to inquire. Frankly, it didn't occur to me. I should have thought that whether the cook knows her job and the state of the mattresses is more your concern than ours. Our interest is in a dead body." Coniston took the barb with good humour. "True. We'll check on the amenities if this conference comes up. The first thing the rich and powerful learn is the value of comfort. I should have mentioned that the last surviving Holcomb is a permanent resident on the island, Miss Emily Holcomb, aged 80+, a former Oxford academic. History, I believe. Your subject, wasn't it, Adam? But weren't you at the other place? She'll either be an ally or a perfect nuisance. If I know anything about academic women, it will be the latter. Thank you for taking this on. We'll be in touch." Harkness rose to escort Coniston and Reeves out of the building. Leaving them at the lifts, Dalgliesh went back to his office. First he must phone Kate and Benton Smith. After that there was a more difficult call. He and Emma Lavenham were to have spent tonight and tomorrow together. If she planned to spend the afternoon in London, she might already be on her way. He'd have to reach her on her mobile phone. It wouldn't be the first call of its kind, and as always, she would be half expecting it. She wouldn't complain. Emma never did. Both of them had had occasional urgent commitments, and their time together was the more precious because it could never be relied upon. And there were 3 words he wanted to say to her, which he found he could never speak over the phone. They, too, would have to wait. He put his head round the door of his PA's room. "Get D.I. Miskin and Sergeant Benton Smith for me, will you, Susie? Then I'll need a car to go to Battersea Heliport, picking up Sergeant Benton Smith first, then Inspector Miskin. Her murder case is in her office. See that it's put in the car, will you?" The call could hardly have come at a less convenient time. After a month of working a 16-hour day, tiredness had caught up with him. And although he could manage tiredness, what he longed for was rest, peace, and for 2 blessed days the company of Emma. He told himself that he had only himself to blame for the spoilt weekend. He wasn't compelled to undertake a possible murder investigation, however politically or socially important the victim, or challenging the crime. There were senior officers who would have preferred him to concentrate on initiatives with which he was already closely involved. The complications of policing a multiracial society in which drugs, terrorism, and international crime conglomerates were the major challenges. The proposal for a new detective force to deal with serious crimes best investigated nationally. The plans would be bedevilled with politics. Top-level policing always had been. The Met needed senior officers who were at ease in that duplicitous world. He saw himself as in danger of becoming one more bureaucrat, a committee member, advisor, coordinator, not a detective. If this happened, would he any longer be a poet? Wasn't it in the rich soil of a murder investigation, in the fascination of the gradual unveiling of truth, in shared exertion and the prospect of danger, and in the pitiableness of desperate and broken lives that his poetry put out its shoots? But now, with Kate and Benton Smith on their way, there were things to be done, and quickly. Meetings to be tactfully cancelled, papers to be locked away, the public relations branch to be put in the picture. He kept a bag always packed for these sudden emergencies, but it was in his Queenhithe flat, and he was glad that he needed to call in there. He had never yet phoned Emma from New Scotland Yard. She would know, as soon as she heard his voice, what he was about to say. She would make her own arrangements for the weekend, perhaps excluding him from her thoughts, as he was from her company. 10 minutes later he closed the door of his office, and for the first time with a backward glance, as if taking leave of a long familiar place he might not see again. Prologue, Chapter 2. In her flat above the Thames, Detective Inspector Kate Miskin was still in bed. Normally, long before this hour, she would have been at her office, and even on a rest day, showered, clothed, and breakfasted. Early rising was habitual for Kate. It was partly by choice, partly a legacy of her childhood, when, burdened with the daily dread of imagined catastrophe, she would drag on her clothes at the moment of waking, desperate to be ready to cope with the expected disaster. A fire in one of the flats below, preventing rescue. A plane crashing through the window. An earthquake shattering the high-rise. The balcony rail trembling, then breaking in her hands. It was always with relief that she would hear her grandmother's frail and querulous voice calling for her early morning tea. Her grandmother had a right to be querulous. The death of the daughter she hadn't wanted to bear, cooped up in a high-rise flat where she hadn't chosen to live, burdened by an illegitimate granddaughter she didn't want to care for and could hardly bear the pain of loving. But her grandmother was dead, and if the past was not dead and never could be, she had learned painfully over the years to recognize and accept the best and the worst of what it had done to her. Now she looked out on a very different London. Her riverside flat was at the end of the building, with a double outlook and 2 balconies. From the sitting room she looked southwest over the river, with its incessant traffic, barges, pleasure boats, the launches of the river police, and the Port of London Authority, the cruise liners making their way upstream to berth at Tower Bridge. From her bedroom she saw the panorama of Canary Wharf, its top like a gigantic pencil, the still water of West India Dock, the Docklands Light Railway, with its trains like childhood clockwork toys. She had always loved the stimulus of contrast, and here she could move from the old to the new, surveying the life of the river in all its contrasts from first light until dusk. At nightfall she would stand at the balcony rail, watching the city transform itself into a shining tableau of light, eclipsing the stars, staining the sky with its reflected crimson glare. The flat, long planned, prudently mortgaged, was her home, her refuge, her security, the dream of years, solidified in bricks and mortar. No colleague had ever been invited to the flat, and her first and only lover, Alan Scully, had long departed for America. He had wanted her to go with him, but she had refused, partly out of fear of commitment, but mainly because her job came first. But now, for the first time since their last night together, she had not been alone. She stretched in the double bed. Beyond the transparent curtains, the morning sky was a clear pale blue above a narrow smudge of grey cloud. Yesterday's forecast had predicted another late autumnal day of alternate sun and showers. She could hear small, agreeable sounds from the kitchen, water hissing into the kettle, the closing of a cupboard door, the clink of china. Detective Inspector Piers Tarrant was making coffee. Alone for the first time since they had arrived together at the flat, she relived the last 24 hours, not with regret, but with amazement that it should have happened. The phone call from Piers had come to her at her office early on Monday. It was an invitation to have dinner on Friday night. The call had been unexpected. Since Piers had left the squad to join the anti-terrorist branch, they hadn't spoken. They had worked together on Dalglish's Special Investigation Squad for years, respected each other, been stimulated by a half-acknowledged rivalry, which she knew Commander Dalglish had made use of, had occasionally argued, passionately but without acrimony. She had found him, and still did, one of the most sexually attractive men she had ever worked with. But even had he sent out tentative, well-recognized signals of sexual interest, she wouldn't have responded. To have an affair with a close colleague was to risk more than one's competence. One of them would have had to leave the squad. It was her job that had freed her from Ellison Fairweather buildings. She wasn't going to jeopardize all she had achieved by going down that seductive but ultimately messy path. She had pocketed her mobile, a little surprised by her ready acceptance of the invitation, and puzzled by what lay behind it. Was there something, she had wondered, that Piers needed to ask or to discuss? It seemed unlikely. The Met rumour mill, usually efficient, had disseminated hints of his dissatisfaction with the new job. But men confided their successes to women, not their misjudgments, and he had suggested that they meet at 7:30 at Sheiky's, after asking her whether she liked fish. The choice of a highly regarded restaurant, which couldn't be expected to be cheap, had sent out a subtle, if confusing, message. Was this to be in some way a celebratory evening, or was this extravagance usual for Piers when he entertained a woman? After all, he had never given the impression that he was short of money, and he was rumoured never to be short of women. He had been waiting for her when she arrived, and as he rose to greet her, she caught his quick, appraising glance, and was glad that she had taken trouble, intricately piling up her strong fair hair, which, when working, she always brushed firmly back, and wore either in a pigtail or tied on the nape of her neck. She was wearing a shirt in dull cream silk, and her only expensive jewellery, antique gold earrings, each set with a single pearl. She was intrigued, and a little amused to see that Piers had taken trouble too. She didn't remember ever having seen him in a suit and tie, and was tempted to say, "Scrub up nicely, don't we?" They were seated at a corner table, safe for confidences, but there had been few. Dinner had been successful, a protracted enjoyment without constraints. He had spoken little of his new job, but that she had expected. They had talked briefly of the books they had recently read, films they had found time to see, conventional exchanges which Kate sensed were no more than the careful social chat of two strangers on a first date. They had moved to more familiar ground, the cases they had worked on together, the latest Met gossip, and from time to time confided small details of their private lives. At the end of the main course of Dover sole, he had asked, "How is the handsome sergeant making out?" Kate was secretly amused. Piers had never successfully concealed his dislike of Francis Benton Smith. Kate suspected that it had less to do with Benton's extraordinary good looks than with a shared attitude to the job, controlled ambition, intelligence, a carefully calculated route to the top, based on the confidence that they brought advantages to policing, which, with luck, would be recognised with fast streaming to promotion. "He's all right. A bit over-anxious to please, perhaps, but weren't we all when A.D. took us on? He'll do. It's rumoured that A.D. might have him in mind for my job." "Your old job?" "It's possible, I suppose. After all, he hasn't filled it yet. The top brass may be waiting to decide what to do about the squad. They could shut it down, who knows? They're always after A.D. for other and bigger jobs. This national CID they're planning, you must have heard the rumours. He's always tied up with one top-level meeting or another." By the time they were eating their puddings, the talk had become desultory. Suddenly Piers said, "I don't like drinking coffee too soon after fish. Or after this wine, but I need sobering up." But that, she thought, had been disingenuous. She never drank enough to risk losing control. "We could go to my flat. It's near enough." She had said, "Or mine. I've got a river view." The invitation, his acceptance, had been totally without strain. He said, "Then yours. I just need to call at my place en route." He had been absent for only 2 minutes, and at her suggestion she had stayed in the car. 20 minutes later, unlocking her flat, coming with him into the wide sitting room with its wall of windows overlooking the Thames, she had seen it with fresh eyes. Conventional, all the furniture modern, no mementos, no evidence that the owner had a private life, parents, a family, objects passed down through generations, as tidy and impersonal as a show flat, cunningly arranged for a quick sale. Without a glance around, he had moved to the windows, then through the door onto the balcony. "I can see why you chose it, Kate." She didn't go out with him, but had stood watching his back, seeing beyond him to the black heaving water, scarred and slashed with silver, the spires and towers, the great blocks on the opposite bank, patterned with oblongs of light. He had come into the kitchen with her while she ground the coffee beans, set out the 2 mugs, heated milk from the fridge. By the time, sitting together on the sofa, they had finished drinking, and he had leaned forward and kissed her gently but firmly on the lips, she knew what would happen. But then hadn't she known from that first moment in the restaurant? He said, "I'd like to shower." She laughed. "How matter-of-fact you are, Piers. The bathroom's through that door." Why not join me, Kate? Not enough room. You go first. It had all been so easy, so natural, so devoid of doubt or anxiety, even of conscious thought. And now, lying in bed in the gentle morning light, hearing the rush of the shower, she thought back over the night in a sweet confusion of memory and half-spoken sentences. I thought you only liked mindless blondes. They weren't all mindless, and you're blonde. She had said, light brown, not yellow blonde. He had turned again towards her, and had run his hands through her hair, a gesture unexpected, not least in its slow gentleness. She had expected that Piers would be an experienced and skilful lover. What she had not expected was how uncomplicated and unstressed had been their joyous carnality. They had lain down with laughter as well as with desire, and afterwards, a little distanced in her double bed, hearing his breathing and feeling the warmth of him flowing towards her, it had seemed natural that he should be there. She knew that their love-making had begun to soften a hard core, compounded of self-mistrust and defensiveness, which she carried on her heart like a weight, and which, after the Macpherson report, had acquired an accretion of resentment and a sense of betrayal. Piers, cynical and more politically sophisticated than she, had shown little patience. All official committees of inquiry know what they are expected to find. Some of the less intelligent do it a little over-enthusiastically. It's ridiculous to lose your job over it, or to let it destroy your confidence or your peace. Dalgliesh, with tact and sometimes wordlessly, had persuaded her not to resign. But she knew that over the past years there had been a slow draining away of the dedication, commitment, and naive enthusiasm with which she had entered the police force. She was still a valued and competent officer. She liked her job, and could contemplate no other for which she was either qualified or suitable. But she had become afraid of emotional involvement, too self-protecting, too wary of what life could do. Now, lying alone and hearing the faint sounds of Piers moving about the flat, she felt an almost forgotten joy. She had been the first to wake, and for the first time without that childhood vestigial anxiety. She had lain relishing her body's contentment for 30 minutes, watching the strengthening light, aware of the first river sounds of the day, before slipping out to the bathroom. The movement had woken him. Stirring, he had reached out for her, then sat up suddenly like a tousled jack-in-the-box. They had both laughed. In the kitchen together, he had squeezed the oranges while she made tea, and later they had taken hot buttered toast out to the balcony and thrown the crusts to the shrieking seagulls in a whirl of wildly beating wings and snapping beaks. Then they had gone back to bed. The rush and gurgle of the shower had ceased. Now it was time finally to get up and face the complications of the day. She had swung her legs out of bed when her mobile phone rang. It jolted her into action as if she had never heard it before. Piers came out of the kitchen, a towel wrapped round his waist, cafetiere in hand. She said, "Oh, God, right on cue." "It might be personal." "Not on this phone." She put out her hand to the bedside table, picked up the phone, listened intently, said, "Yes, sir," and switched off. She said, knowing that she couldn't hide the excitement in her voice, "It's a case. Suspected murder. An island off the Cornish coast. It means a helicopter. I'm to leave my car here. AD is sending one to pick up Benton, and then me. We're to meet at Battersea Heliport." "Your murder kit?" Already she was moving, swiftly, knowing what had to be done and in what order. She called from the bathroom door, "It's in the office. AD'll see it's put in the car." He said, "If he's sending a car, I'd better move quickly. If Nobby Clark's driving and sees me, the driver's mafia will have the news within minutes. I don't see why we should provide entertainment for the canteen gossips." Minutes later, Kate dumped her canvas bag on the bed and began her quick, methodical packing. She would wear, as usual, her woolen trousers and tweed jacket, with a roll-top cashmere jumper. Even if the mild weather continued, there was no point in packing linen or cotton, An island was seldom uncomfortably warm. Stout walking shoes went into the bottom with one change of pants and bra. These could be washed daily. She folded a second warmer jumper into the bag and added a silk shirt, carefully rolled. On top came pyjamas and her woolen dressing gown. She tucked in the spare toilet bag which she always kept ready with the things she needed. Last of all, she threw in 2 new notebooks, half a dozen ballpoint pens, and a half-read paperback. 5 minutes later, both of them were dressed and ready to leave. She walked with Piers to the underground garage. At the door of his Alfa Romeo, he kissed her on the cheek and said, "Thank you for your company at dinner. Thank you for breakfast. Thank you for everything in between. Send me a postcard from your mysterious island. 6 words will be enough. More than enough if they happen to be true. Wish you were here. Love, Kate." She laughed, but didn't reply. The Vauxhall leaving the garage before him had a notice in the rear window, "Baby on board." It always aroused Piers to fury. He grabbed a handwritten card from the glove box and stuck it against the glass. "Herod on board." Then he raised his hand in farewell and was gone. Kate stood looking after him until, hooting a final goodbye, he turned into the main road. And now a different, less complicated, but familiar emotion took over. Whatever problems this extraordinary night might produce, thinking about them would have to wait. Somewhere, as yet only imagined, a body was lying in the cold abstraction of death. A group of people was waiting for the police to arrive, some distressed, most apprehensive. One surely sharing her intoxicated mixture of excitement and resolve. It had always worried her that someone had to die before she could experience this half-guilty exhilaration. And there would be the part she most enjoyed, the team get-together at the end of the day, when A.D., herself, and Benton Smith would ponder over the evidence, picking up, discarding, or clicking the clues into place as they might the pieces of a jigsaw. But she knew the root of the small sprig of shame. Although they had never spoken of it, she suspected that A.D. felt the same. With this jigsaw, the pieces were the broken lives of men and women. 3 minutes later, waiting bag in hand outside the flat, she saw the car turn into the driveway. The working day had begun. Prologue, Chapter 3. Sergeant Francis Benton Smith lived alone on the 16th floor of a post-war block to the northwest of Shepherd's Bush. Beneath him were 15 floors of identical flats and identical balconies. The balconies, which stretched the whole length of each floor, afforded no privacy, but he was only rarely disturbed by his neighbours. One used his flat as a pied-à-terre and was seldom there, and the other, engaged in some mysterious work in the city, left even earlier than did Benton, and returned with conspiratorial quietness in the small hours. The block, previously local authority housing, had been sold off by the council, renovated by private developers, and the flats then put on the market. Despite a reconstructed entrance hall, the modern unvandalized lifts, and the new paint, the block was still an unhappy compromise between prudent economy, civic pride, and institutional conformity. But at least architecturally it was inoffensive. It aroused no emotion other than surprise that anyone should have bothered to put it up. Even the wide view from the balcony was unremarkable. Benton looked out on a drab industrial landscape, patterned in black and greys, and dominated by rectangular slabs of high-rise flats, featureless industrial buildings, and narrow streets of obstinately surviving 19th-century terraces, now the carefully preserved habitat of aspiring young professionals. The Westway rose in a curve above a closely packed caravan park of transients who lived under the concrete pillars, rarely venturing out. Beyond them was a yard piled high with the crumpled metal of derelict cars, the spiked tangle a rusting symbol of the vulnerability of human life and hope. But when night fell, the view was metamorphosed, made insubstantial and mystical by light. Traffic signals changed. Cars moved like automata on liquid roads. The high cranes with their single top lights were angled like praying mantises, grotesque cyclops of the night. Aircraft descended silently towards Heathrow from a blue-black sky, bruised with garish clouds, and as dusk deepened, floor by floor, as if by a signal, the lights came on in the high-rise flats. But neither by night or day was this uniquely a London landscape. Benton felt that he could be looking out over any large city. None of the familiar landmarks lay beneath him. No glimpse of the river, no painted floodlit bridges, no familiar towers or domes. But this carefully chosen anonymity, even the landscape, was what he had wanted. He had put down no roots, having no native soil. He had moved into the flat 6 months after joining the police, and it could not be more different than his parents' home in the leafy street in South Kensington. The white steps up to the pillared front door, the gleaming paint, and immaculate stucco. He had decided to leave the small self-contained flat at the top of the house, partly because he felt it demeaning to be still living at home after the age of 18, but chiefly because he couldn't imagine inviting a colleague to his flat. Even to walk through the main door of the house was to know what it represented: money, privilege, the cultural assurance of the prosperous liberal upper middle class. But he knew that his present apparent independence was spurious. The flat and its contents had been paid for by his parents. On his salary he couldn't otherwise have afforded to move. And he had made himself comfortable. He told himself wryly that only a visitor knowledgeable about modern furniture would have guessed how much the deceptively simple pieces had cost. But there had been no visitors among his colleagues. As a new recruit, he had trodden carefully at first, knowing that he was on a probation more rigorous and protracted than any provisional assessment from senior officers. He had hoped, if not for friendship, for tolerance, respect, and acceptance, and to an extent he had earned them. But he was aware that he was still regarded with wary circumspection. He felt himself to be surrounded by a variety of organizations, including the criminal law, dedicated to protecting his racial sensitivities, as if he could be as easily offended as a Victorian virgin confronted by a flasher. He wished that these racial warriors would leave him alone. Did they want to stigmatize minorities as oversensitive, insecure, and paranoid? But he accepted that the problem was partly of his making, a reserve that was deeper and less forgivable than shyness, and which inhibited intimacy. They didn't know who he was. He didn't know who he was. It wasn't, he thought, only the result of being mixed race. The London world he knew and worked in was peopled with men and women of mixed racial, religious, and national backgrounds. They seemed to manage. His mother was Indian, his father English, she a paediatrician, he the headmaster of a London comprehensive school. They had fallen in love and married when she was 17, his father 12 years older. They had been passionately in love, and they still were. He knew from the wedding photographs that she had been exquisitely beautiful. She still was. She had brought money as well as beauty to the marriage. From childhood he had felt an intruder into that private self-sufficient world. They were both over-busy, and he had learned early that their time together was precious. He knew that he was loved, that his welfare was their concern, but coming quietly and unexpectedly into a room where they were alone, he would see the clouded disappointment on their faces, quickly change into smiles of welcome, but not quickly enough. Their difference in religious belief seemed never to worry them. His father was an atheist, his mother a Roman Catholic, and Francis had been brought up and schooled in that faith. But when in adolescence he gradually let it go, as he might relinquish a part of childhood, neither parent appeared to notice, or if they did, felt that they were justified in questioning him. They had taken him with them on their annual visits to Delhi, and there too he had felt an alien. It was as if his legs, painfully stretched across a spinning globe, could find no secure footing in either continent. His father loved to revisit India, was at home there, was greeted with loud exclamations of delight, laughed, teased, and was teased, wore Indian clothes, performed the salaam with more ease than he shook hands at home, left after tearful goodbyes. As a child and adolescent, Benton was made a great fuss of, exclaimed over, praised for his beauty, his intelligence. But he would stand there ill at ease, politely exchanging compliments, knowing that he didn't belong. He had hoped that selection to Adam Dalglish's Special Investigation Squad would help to make him more at home in his job, perhaps even in his disjointed world. Perhaps to some extent it had. He knew himself to be lucky. Time spent in the squad was a recognized asset when it came to promotion. His last case, which was also his first, a death by fire in a Hampstead museum, had been a test that he felt he had successfully passed. With the next call, there could be problems. Inspector Piers Tarrant was known to be a demanding and occasionally tricky senior officer, but Benton had felt that he knew how to cope with Tarrant, recognizing in him that touch of ambition, cynicism and ruthlessness that he understood and which mirrored his own. But with Tarrant transferred to the anti-terrorist branch, he would be working under Detective Inspector Kate Miskin. Kate Miskin was a less straightforward challenge, and not just because she was a woman. She was always correct and less openly critical than Tarrant, but he sensed that she was ill at ease with him as a colleague. It had nothing to do with his colour, his sex or his social status, although he sensed that she had some hang-ups over class. She just didn't like him. It was as simple and intractable as that. Somehow, and perhaps soon, he would have to learn how to deal with it. But now his thoughts turned to his plans for this free day. He had already cycled to the farmer's market at Notting Hill Gate and bought organic fruit, vegetables and meat for the weekend, some of which he had arranged to take to his mother during the afternoon. He hadn't been home for 6 weeks, and it was time he showed his face, if only to assuage a nagging guilt that he was a less than punctilious son. And in the evening he would cook dinner for Beverley. She was a 21-year-old actress who, straight from drama school, had landed a small part in a long-running television serial set in a Suffolk village. They had met in a local supermarket, a well-known pick-up resource for the solitary or temporarily deprived. After studying him covertly for a minute, she had made the first move by asking him to lift down a tin of tomatoes, conveniently beyond her reach. He was enchanted by her looks, the delicate oval face, the straight black hair cut in a fringe above the slightly slanting eyes, which gave her an engaging look of oriental delicacy. She was, in fact, robustly English, and from much the same professional background as himself. She would have been perfectly at home in his mother's drawing-room. But Beverley had cast off her middle-class social nuances and accent, and changed her unfashionable first name in the service of her career. Her part in the serial, the wayward daughter of the village publican, had caught the public imagination. There were rumours that the character would be developed with exciting possibilities. A rape, an illegitimate child, an affair with a church organist, perhaps even a murder, though not of course of her or the baby. Audiences, she told Benton, didn't like to see murdered babies. In the glitzy, ephemeral firmament of popular culture, Beverley was becoming a star. After sex, which Beverley liked to be inventive, prolonged, but inconveniently hygienic, she would practice her yoga. Propped up on his arm in the bed, Benton would watch her extraordinary contortions with fascinated and indulgent affection. At these moments he knew himself to be dangerously close to love, but had no expectation that the affair would last. Beverley, who was as vocal as a hellfire preacher about the dangers of promiscuity, preferred serial monogamy, but with a carefully defined time limit for each partner. Boredom usually set in after 6 months, she explained helpfully. They had now been together for 5, and although Beverley hadn't yet spoken, Benton had no expectation that either his love-making or his cooking had qualified him for extra time. He was still unpacking his purchases and finding room for them in the fridge when the designated mobile he kept on his bedside table began to ring. He would put out his hand each night to reassure himself that it was still in place. In the morning, setting out for his interim job at the Met, he would slip it in his pocket, willing it to ring. Now, slamming the refrigerator door, he dashed to answer it, as if fearful that the ringing might stop. He listened to the brief message, said, "Yes, sir," and switched off. The day was transformed. His bag, as always, was already packed. He had been told to bring his camera and binoculars, both of which were superior to those owned by other members of the team. So they were to be on their own, calling in no backup, no photographer or socko, unless it proved necessary. Mystery deepened his excitement. And now he had nothing to do but make 2 quick phone calls, one to his mother, the second to Beverly. Both, he suspected, would cause minor inconvenience, but no pain. In happy but half-fearful expectation, he turned his mind to the challenge that awaited him on that as yet unknown offshore island. Book 1. Death on an Offshore Island. Chapter 1. At 7 o'clock on the previous day in Atlantic Cottage on Combe Island, Emily Holcomb stepped out of her shower, tied a towel round her waist, and began smoothing moisturizing cream into her arms and neck. It had become a daily routine for the last 5 years, since her 75th birthday, but she had no sanguine expectation that it could do more than temporarily alleviate the ravages of age, nor did she greatly care. In youth and middle age she had taken little trouble with her looks, and she occasionally wondered whether it might not be both pointless and a little demeaning to begin these time-consuming rituals when the results could gratify no one but herself. But then whom else had she ever wished to gratify? She had always been handsome, some thought beautiful, certainly not pretty. Strong-featured with high cheekbones, large hazel eyes under straight brows, a narrow, slightly aquiline nose, and a wide, well-shaped mouth, which could look deceptively generous. Some men had found her intimidating. Others, among them the more intelligent, were challenged by her barbed wit and responded to her latent sexuality. All her lovers had given her pleasure, none had caused her pain, and the pain she had caused them had long since been forgotten, and even at the time had left her unburdened by remorse. Now, with all passion spent, she had come back to the beloved island of her childhood, to the stone cottage on the cliff edge, which she intended should be her permanent home for the rest of her life. She had no intention that anyone, certainly not Nathan Oliver, should take it from her. She respected him as a writer. He was, after all, acknowledged to be one of the world's greatest novelists. But she had never considered that major talent, even genius, entitled a man to be more selfish and self-indulgent than was common in the majority of his sex. She strapped on her watch. By the time she went back to her bedroom, Rortwood would have removed the early morning tea tray, which arrived promptly at 6:30 each morning, and breakfast would have been laid out in the dining room. The home-made muesli and marmalade, the unsalted butter, the coffee, and the warm milk. Toast wouldn't be made until he heard her passing the kitchen door. She thought of Rortwood with satisfaction and some affection. She had made a good decision for both of them. He had been her father's driver, and when, the last of her family, she had been at the family house on the edge of Exmoor, arranging the final details with the auctioneer and selecting the few items she wished to retain, he had asked to speak to her. "As you are taking up residence on the island, madam, I would like to apply for the post of butler." Combe Island was always referred to as the island by the family and servants, as Combe House on the island was spoken of only as the house. Getting to her feet, she had said, "What on earth would I want with a butler, Rortwood? We haven't had a butler here since my grandfather's day, and I shan't need a driver. No cars are allowed on the island except the buggy for delivering food to the cottages, as you well know." "I used the word butler, madam, as a generic term. What I had in mind were the duties of a personal servant, but conscious that the words could be taken to imply that I was serving a gentleman, butler seemed a more convenient, if not entirely appropriate description." "You've been reading too much P.G. Wodehouse, Rortwood. Can you cook?" "My range is limited, madam, but I think you'll find the results satisfactory.
Oh, well, there probably wouldn't be much cooking. An evening meal will be provided at the house, and I'll probably book in for that. But how healthy are you? Frankly, I don't see myself as a nurse. I have no patience with illness, either in myself or others. I haven't found it necessary to consult a doctor for 20 years, madam, and I'm 25 years younger than yourself, if you'll excuse my mentioning it. Naturally, in the course of things, I can expect to predecease you. When that happens, there probably won't be a house for you on the island. I wouldn't want you to find yourself homeless at 60. That would present no problem, madam. I've a house in Exeter, which at present is let furnished on short-term leases, usually to academics from the university. I propose to retire there eventually. I have an affection for the city. Why Exeter? She had wondered. What part had Exeter played in Rortwood's mysterious past? It was not, she thought, a city to provoke strong affection, except in its residents. Then we might try the experiment. I'll have to consult the other trustees. It will mean that the trust must provide me with 2 cottages, preferably adjacent to each other. I imagine neither of us wish to share a bathroom. I'd certainly prefer a separate cottage, madam. Then I'll see what can be arranged, and we could try it for a month. If we don't suit each other, we can part without acrimony. That had been 15 years ago, and they were still together. He had proved to be an excellent servant and a surprisingly good cook. Increasingly she ate her evening meal in Atlantic Cottage, not at the house. He took 2 holidays a year, each of 10 days exactly. She had no idea where he went or what he did, nor did he ever confide in her. She had always assumed that long-term residents on the island were escaping from something, even if, as in her case, the items on her list were too commonly accepted by the malcontents of her generation to be worth dwelling on. Noise, mobile phones, vandalism, drunken louts, political correctness, inefficiency, and the assault on excellence by renaming it elitism. She knew no more about him now than she did when he had driven her father, and then she had seen him rarely. A square, immobile face, his eyes half hidden by the brim of his chauffeur's cap, his hair unusually blonde for a man, precisely cut in a half-moon on the thick neck. They had established a routine agreeable to both. Every evening at 5 o'clock they would sit down together in her cottage for their daily game of Scrabble, following which they would have a glass or 2 of red wine, the only time they ate or drank with each other, and he would return to his own cottage to prepare her dinner. He was accepted as part of the island's life, but she sensed that his privileged, hardly overworked existence caused some unspoken resentment among the other staff. He had his own unwritten job specification, but even in the rare emergencies never offered to help. They thought he was devoted to her as the last of the Holcombs. She thought that unlikely, and wouldn't have welcomed it. But she did admit to herself that he was in danger of becoming indispensable. Moving into her bedroom with its 2 windows, giving a view both over the sea and across the island, she walked to the northerly window and opened the casement. It had been a blustery night, but the wind had now moderated to a lively breeze. Beyond the land leading to the front porch, the ground rose gently, and on the ridge stood a silent figure, as firmly rooted as a statue. Nathan Oliver was gazing fixedly at the cottage. He was only some 60 feet distant, and she knew that he must have seen her. She drew back from the window, but still watched him as intently as she knew he was watching her. He didn't move, his motionless body contrasting with his swirling white hair, tossed into wildness by the wind. He would have looked like an anathematizing Old Testament prophet, except for the disconcerting stillness. His eyes were fixed on the cottage with a concentrated desire that she felt went beyond the rational reason he put forward for wanting the place. That he came to Combe Island accompanied always by his daughter Miranda and his copy-editor Dennis Tremlett, and required adjacent cottages. Atlantic Cottage, the only one which was semi-detached, was the most desirable on the island. Did he also need, as did she, to live on this dangerous edge, to hear night and day the crash of the tide hurling itself against the cliff face 30 feet below. This, after all, was the cottage in which he had been born, and where he had lived until at 16 he left Combe without explanation and began his solitary quest to become a writer. Was that at the heart of it? Had he come to believe that his talent would wither without this place? He was 12 years younger than she, but did he have a premonition that his work, and perhaps his life, were nearing the end, and that he couldn't find rest for his spirit except in the place where he had been born? For the first time she felt threatened by the power of his will, and she was never free of him. For the past 7 years he had established a habit of coming to the island every 3 months, staying for 2 precisely timed weeks. Even if he didn't succeed in dislodging her, and how could he, his recurring presence on Combe disturbed her peace. Little frightened her except irrationality. Was Oliver's obsession an ominous symptom of something even more disturbing? Was he going mad? And still she stood, unwilling to go down to breakfast while he was standing there. And it was 5 minutes before, finally, he turned and walked away over the ridge. Book 1, Chapter 2. Nathan Oliver lived by routine when in London, and this varied little when he made his quarterly visits to Combe Island. While on Combe, he and his daughter followed the general practice of visitors. A light lunch, usually of soup, cold meats and salad, was delivered each morning by Dan Paget, in accordance with Miranda's telephoned instructions to the housekeeper, Mrs. Burbridge, who conveyed them to the cook. Dinner could be taken either in the cottage or in the main house, but Oliver preferred to eat in Peregrine Cottage, and Miranda did the cooking. For 4 hours on Friday morning he had worked with Dennis Tremlett, editing his latest novel. He preferred to edit on preliminary proofs, typeset from the manuscript, an eccentricity that at some inconvenience his publishers accepted. He edited extensively, even making alterations to the plot, writing on the backs of the typeset pages in his minuscule upright hand, then passing the pages to Tremlett, to be copied more legibly onto a second set. At 1 o'clock they stopped for lunch, and by 2 the simple meal had been eaten, and Miranda had finished the washing up and placed the containers on the shelf in the outside porch for later collection. Tremlett had earlier left to eat with the staff in their dining room. Oliver usually slept in the afternoon until 3:30, when Miranda would wake him for afternoon tea. Today he decided to forego the rest and walk down to the harbour, to be there when the boatman, Jago, brought in the launch. He was anxious to reassure himself that a blood sample taken by Joanna Staveley the previous day had reached the hospital pathology department safely. By 2:30 Miranda had disappeared, binoculars slung round her neck, saying that she was going bird-watching on the northwest coast. Shortly afterwards, carefully replacing both sets of proofs in his desk drawer and leaving the cottage door unlocked, he set off along the cliff edge toward the steep stone path which led down to the harbour. Miranda must have walked quickly. Scanning the scrubland, he could see no sign of her. He was 34 when he married, and the decision was less an impulse of sexual or psychological need than a conviction that there was something slightly suspect about a heterosexual who remained openly celibate, a suggestion either of eccentricity or, more shaming, of the inability to attract a suitable mate. Here he expected no great difficulty, but he was prepared to take his time. He was, after all, a catch. He had no intention of suffering the ignominy of a refusal. But the enterprise, undertaken without enthusiasm, had proved unexpectedly quick and straightforward. It had taken only 2 months of shared dinners and the occasional overnight visit to a discreet country inn to convince him that Sidney Bellinger would be an appropriate choice, a view she had made it plain that she shared. She had already gained a reputation as a distinguished political journalist. The confusion occasionally caused by her ambivalent forename had been, if anything, an advantage. And if her histrionic good looks owed more to money, expert makeup, and an impeccable taste in clothes than to nature, he asked for nothing more, certainly not romantic love.
Although he kept his sexual appetite too much in control ever to be ruled by it, their nights together gave him as much pleasure as he expected to receive from a woman. It was she who made the running, he who acquiesced. He assumed that she saw an equal advantage in the match, and this seemed to him reasonable. The most successful marriages were always based on both partners feeling that they had done rather well for themselves. It might have lasted until now, although he had never relied on permanence, if it hadn't been for Miranda's birth. Here he accepted the major responsibility. At 36, and for the first time, he had detected in himself an irrational desire, the wish to have a son, or at least a child, the acceptance that for a convinced atheist this should at least provide the hope of vicarious immortality. Parenthood was, after all, one of the absolutes of human existence. His birth had been outside his control. Death was inevitable, and would probably be as uncomfortable as birth. Sex he had more or less brought under control. That left parenthood. Not to engage in this universal tribute to human optimism was, for a novelist, to leave a lacuna of experience which could limit the possibilities of his talent. The birth had been a disaster. Despite the expensive nursing home, the labour had been protracted and mismanaged. The final forceps delivery spectacularly painful. The anaesthesia less effective than Sidney had hoped. The visceral tenderness, which had sparked feebly at his first sight of his daughter's slimy and bloody nakedness, quickly died. He doubted whether Sidney had ever felt it. Perhaps the fact that the baby had been taken away immediately into intensive care hadn't helped. Visiting her, he had said, "Wouldn't you like to hold the baby?" Sidney was twisting her head restlessly on the pillows. "For God's sake, let me rest. I don't suppose she wants to be mauled around if she's feeling as bloody as I am." "What do you want to call her?" It was not something they had discussed. "I thought Miranda. It seems a miracle she survived. It's a bloody miracle that I have, and bloody is the appropriate word. Come back tomorrow, will you? I've got to sleep now. And tell them I don't want any visitors. If you're thinking of the family album, wife sitting up in bed, flushed with maternal triumph, and holding a presentable infant, put it out of your mind. And I'm telling you now, I'm finished with this brutal business." She had been a largely absent mother, more affectionate than he would have expected when she was with the child in the Chelsea house, but more often abroad. He had money now, so with their joint incomes there was enough for a nurse, a housekeeper, and for daily help. His own study at the top of the house was forbidden territory to the child, but when he did emerge she would follow him around like a puppy, distanced and seldom speaking, apparently content. But it couldn't last. When Miranda was 4, Sidney, on one of her visits home, said, "We can't go on like this. She needs the companionship of other children. There are schools that take kids as young as 3. I'll get Judith to find out about them." Judith was her PA, a woman of formidable efficiency. In this she proved not only efficient, but surprisingly sensitive. Brochures were sent for, visits made, references taken up. At the end she managed to get husband and wife together, and file in hand made her report. "High trees, outside Chichester, sounds the best. It's a pleasant house with a very large garden, and not too far from the sea. The children seemed happy while I was there, and I visited the kitchen and later had a meal with the younger ones in what they call the nursery wing. Many of the children have parents serving overseas, and the headmistress seems more concerned with health and general happiness than with academic achievement. That may not matter. You did say Miranda shows no signs of being academically gifted. I think she'd be happy there. I can arrange a visit if you'd like to meet the headmistress and see round the school." Afterwards Sidney had said, "I can find an afternoon next Wednesday, and you'd better come. Wouldn't look good if people knew we'd shoved her off to school with only one of us caring enough to see where she's going." So they went together, as distanced, as much strangers as if they were official school inspectors. Sidney played the concerned mother to perfection. Her analysis of her daughter's needs and their hopes for her was impressive. He could hardly wait to get back to his study and write it down. But the children did indeed appear uninhibitedly happy, and Miranda was sent there within a week. The school took pupils during the holidays as well as in term time, and Miranda seemed to miss High Trees on the few occasions when it was convenient for her to spend part of a holiday at home. After High Trees came a boarding school, which offered a reasonably sound education with a kind of quasi-maternal care which Sidney thought desirable. The education didn't go beyond a few examinations at GCSE level, but Oliver told himself that Miranda hardly qualified for Cheltenham Ladies' College or St. Paul's. End of Disc 1. Disc 2. She was 16 when he and Sidney divorced. He was surprised at the passion with which Sidney catalogued his inadequacies. "You really are an appalling man. Selfish, rude, pathetic. Don't you honestly realize how much you suck the life out of other people? Used them? Why did you want to be there when Miranda was born? Blood and mess are hardly your thing, are they? And you weren't there for me. If you felt anything for me, it was physical disgust. You thought you might like to write about childbirth, and you did write about childbirth. You have to be there, don't you? You have to listen and watch and observe. It's only when you've got the physical details right that you can produce all that psychological insight, all that humanity. What did the last Guardian reviewer write? As close as we're likely to get to a modern Henry James. And of course you've got the words, haven't you? I'll give you that. Well, I've got my own words. I don't need your talent, your reputation, your money, or your occasional attention in bed. We may as well have a civilized divorce. I'm not keen on advertising failure. It's helpful that this job in Washington has come up. That'll tie me down for the next 3 years." He had said, "And what about Miranda? She seems anxious to leave school." "So you say. The girl hardly communicates with me. She did when she was a kid, but not now. God knows what you'll do with her. As far as I can tell, she isn't interested in anything." "I think she's interested in birds. At least she cuts out pictures of them and sticks them on that board in her room." He had felt a great spurt of self-congratulation. He had noticed something about Miranda which Sidney had missed. His words were an affirmation of responsible parentage. "Well, she won't find many birds in Washington. She'd better stay here. What on earth could I do with her?" "What can I do? She should be with her mother." And then she had laughed. "Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Why not let her housekeep for you? You could have holidays on that island where you were born. There should be enough birds there to make her happy, and you'd save on a housekeeper's wages." He had saved on wages, and there had been birds on Combe, although the adult Miranda showed less enthusiasm for bird-watching than she had as a child. The school had at least taught her how to cook. She had left at 16 with no qualifications other than that, and an undistinguished academic record, and for the last 16 years had lived and travelled with him as his housekeeper, quietly efficient, uncomplaining, apparently content. He had never thought it necessary to consult her about the quarterly and almost ceremonial migrations from the Chelsea house to Combe, any more than he would have thought it appropriate to consult Tremlett. He took it for granted that both were willing appendages to his talent. If challenged, and he never was, even by the inconvenient inner promptings which he knew others might call conscience, he would have had his answer ready. They had chosen their way of life, were adequately paid, well fed and housed. On his overseas tours they travelled with him in luxury. Neither appeared to want or was qualified for anything better. What had surprised him on his first return to Combe 7 years ago had been the sudden amazed exhilaration with which he had stepped ashore from the launch. He had embraced this euphoria with the romantic imaginings of a boy, a conqueror taking triumphant possession of his hard-won territory, an explorer finding at last the fabled shore. And that night, standing outside Peregrine Cottage and looking out towards the distant Cornish coast, he knew that he had been right to return. Here, in this sea-girt peace, the inexorable progress of physical decay might be slowed. Here his words would come back. But he knew, too, from first seeing it again, that he had to have Atlantic Cottage. Here in this stone cottage, which seemed to have grown out of the dangerous cliff below, he had been born, and here he would die. This overwhelming need was buttressed by considerations of space and convenience, but there was something more elemental. Something in his blood responded to the ever-present rhythmic pulse of the sea. His grandfather had been a seaman, and had died at sea. His father had been boatman in the old days on Combe, and he had lived with him in Atlantic Cottage until he was 16, and could at last escape his father's alternate drunken rages and maudlin affection, and set out alone to make himself a writer. Throughout those years of hardship, of travel and loneliness, if he thought of Combe, it was as a place of violent emotions, of danger, an island not to be visited, since it held in thrall the forgotten traumas of the past. Walking along the cliff towards the harbour, he thought how strange it was that he should return to Combe with such an assurance of coming home. Book 1, Chapter 3. It was just after 3 o'clock, and in his office on the second floor of the tower of Combe House, Rupert Maycroft was at work drawing up estimates for the next financial year. At a similar desk set against the far wall, Adrian Boyd was silently checking the accounts for the quarter ended 30th September. Neither was engaged on his favourite job, and each worked in silence, a silence broken only by the rustle of paper. Now Maycroft stretched back in his chair and let his eyes rest on the view from the long curved window. The warm, unseasonable weather was continuing. There was only a light wind, and the wrinkled sea stretched as deeply blue as in high summer, under an almost cloudless sky. To the right, on a spur of rock, stood the old lighthouse, with its gleaming white walls, topped by the red lantern enclosing the now defunct light, an elegant phallic symbol of the past, lovingly restored but redundant. Sometimes he found its symbolism uncomfortable. To the left he could glimpse the curved arms of the harbour entrance and the stunted towers of the harbour lights. It was this view and this room which had informed his decision to come to Combe. Even now, after 18 months, he could find himself surprised to be on the island. He was only 58, in good health, his mind, as far as he could judge, functioning unimpaired. And yet he had taken early retirement from his practice as a country town solicitor, and had been glad to go. The decision had been precipitated by the death 2 years ago of his wife. The car accident had been shockingly unexpected, as fatal accidents always are, however predicted and warned against. She had been on her way from Warnborough to attend a book club meeting in a neighbouring village, driving too fast along a narrow country road which had become dangerously familiar. Taking a corner at speed, she had crashed her Mercedes head-on with a tractor. During the weeks following the accident, the edge of grief had been blunted by the necessary formalities of bereavement, the inquest, the funeral, the seemingly endless consolatory letters to be answered, the protracted visit of his son and daughter-in-law. While his future domestic comfort was discussed sometimes, he felt as if he was not present. When, some 2 months after her death, grief unexpectedly overwhelmed him, he was as astonished by its power as he was by its unexpectedness, compounded as it was by remorse, guilt, and a vague, unfocused longing. The Combe Island Trust was among his firm's clients. The original trustees had viewed London as the dark heart of duplicitous and crafty machinations designed to entrap innocent provincials, and had been happier choosing a local and long-established practice. The firm had continued to act for the trust, and when it was suggested that he might fill the interregnum between the retirement of the resident secretary and the appointment of his successor, he had seized the opportunity to get away from his practice. Official retirement made the break permanent. Within 2 months of his appointment at Combe Island, he was told that the job was his if he cared to take it. He had been glad to get away. The Warnborough hostesses, most of whom had been Helen's friends, alleviated the mild boredom of provincial domesticity by the euphoria of benevolent intention. Mentally he paraphrased Jane Austen. A widower in possession of a house and a comfortable income must be in want of a wife. It was kindly meant, but since Helen's death he had been smothered with kindness. He had come to dread the regular weekly invitations to lunch or dine. Had he really given up his job and come to this isolation merely to escape the unwelcome advances of local widows? At times of introspection, like the present, he accepted that it could have been so. The prospective successors to Helen had seemed so much of a type that it was difficult to tell them apart. His own age or a little younger, pleasant-faced, and some of them pretty, kindly, well-dressed and well-groomed. They were lonely, and assumed that he was too. At every dinner party he worried that he would forget a name, ask the same innocuous questions about children, holidays or hobbies that he had asked before, and with the same feigned interest. He could imagine his hostess's anxious telephone calls after a carefully calculated wait. "How did you get on with Rupert Maycroft? He seemed to enjoy talking to you. Has he phoned?" He hadn't phoned, but had known that one day, in a mood of quiet desperation, loneliness, or weakness, he would. His decision to give up his partnership in the practice, to move, at first temporarily, to Combe Island, had been received with the expected expressions of public regret. They had said how much he would be missed, how greatly he had been valued, but it now struck him forcibly that no one had attempted to dissuade him. He comforted himself with the thought that he had been respected, even perhaps a little loved by his long-standing clients, most of them inherited from his father. They had seen him as the epitome of the old-fashioned family solicitor, the confidential friend, keeper of secrets, protector and adviser. He had drawn up their wills, dealt efficiently with their property transactions, represented them before the local magistrates, all of whom he knew, when they were summoned for their petty delinquencies, mostly contested parking or speeding offences. Shoplifting by the wife of a local clergyman was the most serious case he could remember, a scandal that had provided enjoyable gossip in the parish for weeks. With his plea in mitigation, the case had been compassionately dealt with by the ordering of medical reports and a moderate fine. His clients would miss him, would remember him with sentimental nostalgia, but not for long. The firm of Maycroft, Forbes and Mackintosh would expand. New partners would be recruited, new premises equipped. Young Mackintosh, who was due to qualify next year, had already put forward his plans. His own son, Helen's and his only child, would thoroughly have sympathised. He now worked in London in a city firm with over 40 solicitors, a high degree of specialisation, distinguished clients, and a fair share of national publicity. He had now been on Combe for 18 months. Cut off from the reassuring routines which had buttressed the inner self, he found himself ironically more at peace and yet more prone to inner questioning. At first the island had confused him. Like all beauty, it both solaced and disturbed. It held an extraordinary power to compel introspection, not all of it gloomy, but most of it searching enough to induce discomfort. How predictable, how comfortable his 58 years had been, the over-guarded childhood, the carefully chosen prep school, the years until 18 at a minor but respected public school, the expected upper second at Oxford. He had chosen to follow his father's profession, not from enthusiasm, or even, it now seemed, from conscious choice, but out of a vague filial respect, and the knowledge that an assured job was waiting for him. His marriage had been less an affair of passion than a choice from the small coterie of suitable girls among the members of the Warnborough tennis and dramatic clubs. He had never taken a really difficult decision, been tortured by a difficult choice, engaged in a dangerous sport, accomplished anything beyond the achievements of his job. Was it, he wondered, one result of being an only child, treasured and overprotected? The words from childhood most often recalled were his mother's. "Don't touch that, darling, it's dangerous. Don't go there, darling, you might fall. I shouldn't see too much of her, darling, she's not exactly our type." He thought that his first 18 months on Combe had been reasonably successful. No one had said otherwise. But he recognised two mistakes, Both new appointments. Both he now knew were ill-advised. Daniel Paget and his mother had come to the island at the end of June 2003. Paget had written to him, although not by name, inquiring if there was a vacancy for a cook and a handyman. The then handyman was about to retire, and the letter, well written, persuasive, and accompanied by a reference, had seemed opportune. No cook was required, but Mrs. Plunkett had hinted that extra help would be welcome. It had been a mistake. Mrs. Paget was already a very sick woman with only months to live. Months which she had apparently been determined to spend on an island, seen as a child, on visits to the mainland, and which had become a fantasy Shangri-La. Most of Paget's time, helped by Joanna Staveley and occasionally by Mrs. Burbridge, the housekeeper, had been spent looking after her. Neither had complained, but Maycroft knew that they were paying for his folly. Dan Paget was an excellent handyman, but he managed, although wordlessly, to make it plain that he disliked being on the island. Maycroft had overheard Mrs. Burbridge speaking to Mrs. Plunkett. "Of course he's not really an islander, and now that his mother's gone, I don't think he'll be here much longer." "He's not an islander" was on Combe a damning indictment. And then there was 18-year-old Milly Tranter. He had taken her in because Jago, the boatman, had found her homeless and begging in Pentworthy, and had phoned in to ask if she could come back on the launch until arrangements could be made for her. Apparently it was either that, leaving her to be picked up by the first predatory mail, or handing her over to the police. Milly had arrived and been given a room in the stable block, and a job helping Mrs. Burbridge with the linen and Mrs. Plunkett in the kitchen. That at least was working well, but Milly and her future remained a nagging anxiety. Children were no longer allowed on the island, and Milly, although in law an adult, had the unpredictability and waywardness of a child. She couldn't remain on Combe indefinitely. Maycroft looked across at his colleague, at the long-boned, sensitive face, the pale skin which seemed impervious to sun and wind, the lock of dark hair falling across the forehead. It was a scholar's face. Boyd had been some months on the island when Maycroft arrived, he too a fugitive from life. Boyd had been brought to Combe Island through the auspices of Mrs. Evelyn Burbridge. As the widow of a vicar, she still had connections in the clerical world. He had never questioned either of them directly, but knew, as he supposed most people on the island knew, that Boyd, an Anglican priest, had resigned from his living either because of a loss of faith or his alcoholism, or perhaps a mixture of both. Maycroft felt himself incapable of understanding either predicament. For him, wine had always been a pleasure, not a necessity, and his former Sunday attendance at church with Helen had been a weekly affirmation of his Englishness and of acceptable behaviour, a mildly agreeable obligation devoid of religious fervour. His parents had distrusted religious enthusiasm, and any wild clerical innovations which threatened their comfortable orthodoxy had been summed up by his mother. "We're C of E, darling. We don't do that sort of thing." He found it odd that Boyd should resign because of recently acquired doubts about dogma. A loss of faith in dogma was an occupational hazard for priests of the Church of England, judging from the public utterances of some of the bishops. But the Church's loss had been his gain. He couldn't now envisage the job at Combe without Adrian Boyd at the other desk. Guiltily, he realized that he must have been staring out of the window for over 5 minutes. Resolutely he turned eyes and mind to the work in hand. But his good intentions were frustrated. There was a bang on the door, and Milly Tranter bounced in. She came to the office seldom, but always arrived in the same way, seeming to materialize on his side of the door before his ears caught her knock. She said, with no attempt to hide her excitement, "There's big trouble down at the harbour, Mr. Maycroft. Mr. Oliver said you was to come at once. He's really wild. It's something to do with Dan losing his blood sample overboard." Milly seemed impervious to cold. Now she was celebrating the warm day by wearing her heavily buckled jeans low on her hips with a short T-shirt barely covering the childlike breasts. Her midriff was bare, and there was a gold stud in the umbilicus. Maycroft thought that perhaps he had better have a word with Mrs. Burbridge about Milly's clothes.
Admittedly, none of the visitors was likely to see much of her, clad or unclad, but he couldn't believe that his predecessor would have tolerated the sight of Milly's naked stomach. Now he said, "What were you doing at the harbour, Milly? Aren't you supposed to be helping Mrs. Burbridge with the linen?"
"Done that, haven't I? She said I could bunk off. I went to help Jago unload."
"Jago's perfectly competent to unload himself. I think you'd better go back to Mrs. Burbridge, Milly. There must be something useful you can do." Milly made a pantomime of casting her eyes upward, but went without argument. Maycroft said, "Why do I always talk to that child like a schoolmaster? Do you suppose that I might understand her better if I'd had a daughter? Do you think she can possibly be happy here?" Boyd looked up and smiled. "I shouldn't worry, Rupert. Mrs. Burbridge finds her useful, and they get on well. It's a pleasure to have someone young about. When Milly's had enough of Combe, she'll be off. I suppose Jago is the attraction. She's always at Harbour Cottage. I hope she doesn't cause complications there. He really is indispensable." "I think Jago can cope with adolescent passion. If you're worried about possible trouble if Jago seduces her, or she him, which is more likely, don't. It won't happen." "Won't it?" Adrian said gently, "No, Rupert, it won't." "Oh, well, I suppose that's a relief. I don't think I was really worried. I doubted whether Jago would have the time or the energy. Still, sex is something most people find time and energy for." Adrian said, "Shall I go down to the harbour?" No, I'd better go." Boyd was the last one who should be asked to confront Oliver. Maycroft felt a second's irritation that the suggestion should have been made. The walk to the harbour was one of his favourites. Usually it was with an uplifting of his spirits that he crossed the forecourt of the house and took the narrow, pebble-strewn path towards the steps which led down the cliff to the quay. And now the harbour lay beneath him like a coloured picture from a storybook, the two stunted towers topped with lights on each side of the narrow entrance, Jago Tamlin's neat cottage, with the row of large terracotta pots in which he would plant his summer geraniums, the coiled ropes and the spotless bollards, the tranquil inner water, and beyond the harbour mouth, the restless sea and the distant counterflow of the riptide. Sometimes he would leave his desk and walk to the harbour when the launch was due, silently watching for its appearance with the atavistic pleasure of islanders down the ages, awaiting the arrival of a long-expected ship. But now he walked slowly down the final steps, aware that his approach was being studied. At the quayside, Oliver was standing rigid with fury. Jago, disregarding him, was busying himself with the unloading. Paget, ashen-faced, was pressed against the wall of the cabin, as if facing a firing squad. Maycroft said, "Is anything wrong?" Silly question, the peremptory silence, Oliver's white face, implied a more than trifling misdemeanour on Paget's part. Oliver said, "Well, tell him, one of you. Don't just stand there, tell him." Jago's voice was expressionless. "Mrs. Burbridge's library books, some shoes and handbags that belonged to Mrs. Paget and which Dan was taking to the Oxfam shop, and Mr. Oliver's blood sample have been lost overboard." Oliver's voice was controlled but staccato with outrage. "Note the order. Mrs. Burbridge's library books. Obviously an irreparable loss to the local public library. Some unfortunate pensioner looking for a pair of cheap shoes at the charity shop will be disappointed. The fact that I shall have to give blood again is of no importance compared with those major catastrophes." Jago was beginning to speak, but Oliver pointed to Paget. "Let him answer. He's not a child. It was his fault." Paget made an attempt at dignity. He said, "I had the packet with the blood sample and the other things in a canvas bag slung over my shoulder. I was leaning over the rail looking at the water, and the bag slipped off." Maycroft turned to Jago. "Didn't you stop the launch? Couldn't you get a bill hook to it?" "It was the shoes, Mr. Maycroft. They were heavy and they sunk quickly. I heard Dan shout out, but it was too late." Oliver said, "I want to speak to you, Maycroft. Now, please, and in the office." Maycroft turned to Paget. I'll talk to you later. That's schoolmaster's voice again. He was about to add, don't worry about it too much, but knew that the comfort implied in the words would only antagonize Oliver further. The look of terror on Paget's face worried him. Surely it was disproportionate to the crime. The library book would be paid for. The loss of the shoes and handbags hardly warranted more than a sentimental regret that could only be felt by Paget himself. Oliver might be one of those unfortunates with a pathological hatred of needles. But if so, why had he asked to have blood taken on the island? A mainland hospital would probably have had the more modern thumb-pricking method of taking blood. The thought brought back memory of the blood tests on his wife some 4 years earlier, when she had been treated for a deep vein thrombosis following a long flight. The memory, coming at such an incongruous moment, brought no comfort. Confronting Oliver's white and rigid face, on which the jutting bones seemed to have solidified into stone, the memory of their joint visits sitting together in the hospital outpatients department only reinforced his sense of inadequacy. Helen would have said, "Stand up to the man. You're in charge. Don't let him bully you. There's nothing seriously wrong with him. No harm's been done. Giving another sample of blood isn't going to kill him." So why at this moment did he have an irrational conviction that somehow it could? They made their way up the pathway to the house in silence, Maycroft accommodating his strides to Oliver's pace. He had last seen the man only 2 days previously, when there had been the expected encounter in his office about Atlantic Cottage. Now, glancing down at him, at the fine head which reached only to Maycroft's shoulder, the strong white hair lifted by the breeze, he saw with reluctant compassion that even in that short time Oliver seemed visibly to have aged. Something, was it confidence, arrogance, hope, had seeped out of him. He was now toiling painfully, that much-photographed head looking incongruously heavy for the short, enfeebled body. What was wrong with the man? He was only 68, hardly more than late middle-aged by modern reckoning, but he looked over 80. In the study, Boyd got to his feet, and at a nod from Maycroft, silently left. Oliver, refusing a chair, supported himself by clasping its back and confronting Maycroft across the desk. His voice was in control, the words calmly delivered. "I have only 2 things to say, and I shall be brief. In my will, I have divided what the Treasury is graciously pleased to leave me, equally between my daughter and the Combe Island Trust. I have no other dependents and no charitable interest, or indeed any desire to relieve the state of its obligations towards the less fortunate. I was born on this island, and I believe in what it does, or in what it used to do. Unless I can be given an assurance that I shall be welcome here as often as I choose to come, and that I shall be provided with the accommodation I need for my work, I shall change my will." Maycroft said, "Isn't that rather a drastic response to what was clearly an accident?" "It was not an accident. He did it on purpose." "Surely not. Why should he? He was careless and stupid, but it wasn't meant." "I assure you it was meant. Paget should never have been allowed to come here and to bring his mother with him. She was obviously dying at the time, and he misled you about her condition and her competence to work. But I'm not here to discuss Paget or to teach you how to do your job. I've said what I wanted to say. Unless things change here, my will shall be altered as soon as I return to the mainland." Maycroft said carefully, "That, of course, is your decision. I can only say I'm sorry if you feel we've failed you. You have the right to come whenever you choose. That is clear under the deed of the trust. Anyone born on the island has that right, and as far as we know you're the only living person to whom that applies. Emily Holcombe has a moral right to Atlantic Cottage. If she consents to move, then the cottage will be yours. Then I suggest you let her know the cost of her obstinacy." Maycroft said, "Is that all?" "No, it is not all. I said there were 2 matters. The second is that I propose to take up residence permanently on Combe as soon as the necessary arrangements can be made. I shall, of course, require the appropriate accommodation. While I am waiting for a decision on Atlantic Cottage, I suggest additions are made to Peregrine Cottage to make it at least temporarily acceptable." Maycroft desperately hoped that his face didn't convey the dismay he felt. He said, "I shall, of course, tell the trustees. We'll have to look at the trust deed. I'm not sure if permanent residents other than those actually working here can be allowed. Emily Holcombe, of course, is provided for in the deed." Oliver said, "The wording is that no person born on the island can be refused admission. I was born on Combe. There is no prohibition on the length of stay. I think you'll find that what I propose is legally possible, without the need to change the terms of the trust." Without another word he turned and was gone. Staring at the door, which Oliver had shut with a firmness just short of a slam, Maycroft sank into his chair, a wave of depression as heavy as a physical weight on his shoulders. This was catastrophe. Was the job he had taken as an easy temporary option, a peaceful interval in which he could come to terms with his loss, evaluate his past life and decide on his future, to end in failure and humiliation? The trustees knew that Oliver had always been difficult, but his predecessor had coped. He didn't hear Emily Holcombe's knock, but suddenly she was crossing the room towards him. She said, "I've been talking to Mrs. Burbridge in the kitchen. Milly's there, bleating about some problem down at the quay. Apparently Dan has dropped Oliver's blood sample overboard." Maycroft said, "Oliver's been in here complaining. He took it very badly. I tried to explain that it was an accident." He knew that his dismay and, yes, his inadequacy were written on his face. She said, "An odd kind of accident. I suppose he can give another sample. There must be some blood left, even in his grudging veins. Aren't you taking this too seriously, Rupert?" "That's not all. We've got a problem. Oliver's threatening to cut the trust out of his will." "That will be inconvenient, but hardly disastrous. We're not on the breadline." "He's made another threat. He wants to live here permanently." "But he can't. The idea's impossible." Maycroft said miserably, "It may not be impossible. I'll have to look at the trust deed. We may not legally be able to stop him." Emily Holcombe made for the door, then turned to face him. She said, "Legally or illegally, he's got to be stopped. If no one else has the guts to do it, then I shall." Book 1, Chapter 4. The place that Miranda Oliver and Dennis Tremlett had discovered for themselves had seemed as propitious and unexpected as a small miracle. A grassy depression on the lower cliff, about 100 yards south of an ancient stone chapel, and less than 3 yards from the sheer 40-foot drop to a small inlet of churning sea. The shallow was bound by high granite rocks on each side, and accessible only by clambering and slithering down the steep boulder-strewn incline, tangled with bushes. They provided convenient boughs to hang on to, and the descent wasn't particularly difficult, even for the partially lame Dennis. But it was unlikely to tempt anyone who wasn't looking for a secret hiding place, and only a watcher peering down from the extreme edge of the friable overhanging cliff would have a chance of seeing them. Miranda had happily discounted that possibility. Desire, excitement, the optimism of hope had been too intoxicating to admit what were surely unlikely contingencies and spurious fears. Dennis had tried to share her confidence, had forced into his voice the enthusiasm he knew she expected and needed from him. For her, the closeness to the dangerous cliff edge enhanced the invulnerability of their refuge, and gave an erotic edge to their love-making. Now they lay bodily close, but distanced in thought, their faces upheld to the blue tranquillity of the sky and a tumble of white clouds. The unusual strength of the autumn sun had warmed the enclosing boulders, and they were both naked to their waists. Dennis had pulled up his jeans, still unzipped, and Miranda's corduroy skirt was crumpled over her thighs. Her other clothes lay in a tumbled heap beside her, her binoculars thrown over them. Now, with the most urgent physical need satisfied, all his other senses were preternaturally acute. His ears, as always on the island, throbbed with a cacophony of sound, the pounding of the sea, the crash and swirl of the waves, and the occasional wild shriek of a seagull. He could smell the crushed turf and the stronger earth, a faint, unrecognized smell, half sweet, half sour, from the clump of bulbous-leaved plants, brightly green against the silver of the granite, the sea smell, and the pungent sweat of warm flesh and sex. He heard Miranda give a small, satisfied sigh of happiness. It provoked in him an uprush of tenderness and gratitude, and he turned his face towards hers and gazed at her tranquil profile. She always looked like this after they had made love, the complacent secret smile, the face smooth and looking years younger, as if a hand had passed over her skin, conjuring away the faint etchings of incipient middle age. She had been a virgin when they first came together, but there had been nothing tentative or passive about their desperate coupling. She had opened herself to him as if this moment could compensate for all the dead years. And sexual fulfillment had released in her more than the body's half-acknowledged need for warm, responsive flesh, for love. Their stolen hours, apart from the overriding need for physical love, had been spent in talk, sometimes desultory, more often as spilling out of pent-up, long-repressed resentment and unhappiness. He knew something of what her life with her father had been. He had watched it for 12 years. But if he had felt pity, it had been only a fleeting emotion, untouched by any affection for her. There had been an intimidating unattractiveness about her too obvious efficiency, her reserve, the time she seemed to treat him more like a servant than her father's confidential assistant. She seemed almost at times not to notice he was there. He told himself that she was her father's child. Oliver had always been a demanding taskmaster, particularly when he was undertaking overseas publicity tours. Dennis wondered why he still bothered. They couldn't possibly be commercially necessary. Publicly, Oliver said that it was important for a writer to meet his public, to speak to the people who bought and read him, to undertake in return the small service of signing their copies. Dennis suspected that there were other reasons. The tours ministered to a need for public affirmation of the respect, even the adoration, which so many thousands felt for him. But the tours were a strain, compensated for by fussiness and irritation, which only his daughter and Tremlett were allowed to see. Miranda made herself unpopular by criticisms and requests which her father never voiced directly. She inspected every hotel room he was given, ran his baths when the complicated apparatus controlling hot, cold, shower and bath was beyond him, made sure his free time was sacrosanct, ensured that he had the food he liked, served promptly, even at inconvenient times. He had peculiar foibles. Miranda and the accompanying publicity girl had to ensure that readers who wanted their books dedicated presented him with the name written plainly in capitals. He made himself endure long signing sessions with good humour, but couldn't tolerate being presented, once his pen was put away, with late requests for dedication from the bookstore staff or their friends. Miranda would tactfully collect their copies to take back to the hotel, promising that they would be ready by the next morning. Tremlett knew that she was seen as an irritating addition to the tour, someone whose peremptory efficiency contrasted with her famous father's willingness to put himself out. He himself was always given an inferior room in the hotels. They were more luxurious than anything he had been used to, and he made no complaint. He suspected Miranda would have received the same treatment, except that she bore the name Oliver, and her father needed her next door. And now, lying beside her quietly, he remembered how the love affair had started. It was in the hotel in Los Angeles. It had been a long and stressful day, and at 11:30, when she had at last settled her father for the night, Dennis had seen her at the door of her room, half leaning against it, her shoulders drooping. She seemed unable to get the card into the lock, and on impulse he had taken it from her and opened the door. He saw that her face was drained with exhaustion, and that she was on the verge of tears. Instinctively, he had put his arm round her and had helped her into the room. She had clung to him, and after a few minutes, he wasn't sure now quite how, their lips had met, and they were kissing passionately between incoherent mutterings of love. He had been lost in a confusion of emotions, but the sudden awakening of desire had been the strongest, and their move towards the bed had seemed as natural and inevitable as if they had always been lovers. But it was Miranda who had taken control. It was Miranda who had gently broken free and picked up the telephone. She had ordered champagne for 2 and directed it to come immediately, please. It was Miranda who had instructed him to wait in the bathroom until it was delivered. Miranda who had put a do not disturb notice on the outside of the door. None of it mattered now. She was in love. He had awoken her to a life which she had seized on with all the obstinate determination of the long deprived, and she would never let go, which meant never letting him go. But he told himself that he didn't want to go. He loved her. If this wasn't love, what else could he call it? He, too, had been awakened to sensations almost frightening in their intensity, the masculine triumph of possession, gratitude that he could give and receive so much pleasure, tenderness, self-confidence, the shedding of fears that solitary sex was all that he would ever have, or was capable of, or deserved. But now, lying in mild post-coital exhaustion, there came again the inrush of anxiety. Fears, hopes, plans, jostled in his mind like lottery balls. He knew what Miranda wanted: marriage, a home of her own, and children. He told himself that that was what he too wanted. She was radiantly optimistic. For him it seemed a distant, unrealizable dream. When they talked and he listened to her plans, he tried not to destroy them, but he couldn't share them. As she poured out a stream of happy imaginings, he realized with dismay that she had never really known her father. It seemed strange that she, who was Oliver's child, who had lived with him, had travelled with him all over the world, knew less of the essential man than did he after only 12 years. He knew that he was underpaid, exploited, never admitted to Oliver's full confidence, except when they were working on a novel. But then so much had been given: removal from the noise, the violence, the humiliation of his teaching job at an inner-city comprehensive, and later the uncertainty and poor pay of his job as a freelance copy editor. The satisfaction of having a part, however small and unacknowledged, in the creative process, seeing a mass of incoherent ideas come together and be formed into a novel. He was meticulous in his copy editing. Every neat symbol, every addition or deletion was a physical pleasure. Oliver refused to be edited by his publishers, and Dennis knew that his value went far beyond that of copy editor. Oliver would never let them go. Never. Would it be possible, he wondered, to carry on as they were now? The stolen hours which, with cunning, they could increase? The secret life which would make everything else bearable? The thrill of sex heightened because it was forbidden fruit? But that, too, was impossible. Even to contemplate it was a betrayal of her love and her trust. Suddenly he recalled long-forgotten words, lines from a poem. Donne, wasn't it? Who is as safe as us, where none can do treason to us, except one of we two? Even warmed by her naked flesh, treason slithered like a snake into his mind and lay there heavily coiled, somnolent but unshiftable. She raised her head. She knew something of what he was thinking. That was the terrifying thing about love. He felt that he had handed over the key to his mind, and she could wander in it at will. She said, "Darling, it's going to be all right. I know you're worrying. Don't. There's no need." She said again with a firmness close to obstinacy, "It's going to be all right." "But he needs us. He depends on us. He won't let us go. He won't let our happiness upset his whole life, the way he lives, how he works, what he's used to. I know it would be fine for some people, but not for him. He can't change. It would destroy him as a writer." She raised herself on her elbow, looking at him. "But, darling, that's ridiculous. And even if he did have to give up writing, would that be so terrible? Some critics are already saying that he's done his best work. Anyway, he won't have to do without us. We can live in your flat, at least to begin with. and go into him daily. I'll find a reliable housekeeper to sleep in the Kensington house, so he won't be alone at night. It might even suit him better. I know he respects you, and I think he's fond of you. He'll want me to be happy. I'm his only child. I love him. He loves me."
He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, but at last he said slowly,
"I don't think he loves anyone but himself. He's a conduit. Emotion flows through him. He can describe, but he can't feel, not for other people. But, darling, that can't be true. Think of all those characters, the variety, the richness. All the reviewers say the same. He couldn't write like that if he didn't understand his characters and feel for them."
He said, "He does feel for his characters. He is his characters." And now she stretched herself over him, looking down into his face, her pendulous breasts almost touching his cheeks. And then she froze. He saw her face, now uplifted, white as granite and stark with fear. With one clumsy movement he broke free from under her and clutched at his jeans. Then he too looked up. For a moment, disorientated, all he could see was a figure, black, motionless and sinister, planted on the extreme edge of the upper cliff and shutting out the light. Then reality asserted itself. The figure became real and recognizable. It was Nathan Oliver. Book 1, Chapter 5. It was Mark Yellen's third visit to Combe Island, and, as on the previous occasions, he had asked for Mirlet Cottage, the most northerly on the northeast coast. Although further from the cliff edge than Atlantic Cottage, it was built on a slight ridge and had one of the finest views on Combe. On his first visit 2 years previously, he had known from the moment of entering its stone-walled tranquillity that he had at last found a place where the daily anxieties of his dangerous life could for 2 weeks be put aside, and he could examine his work, his relationships, his life, in the peace which at work and at home he never knew. Here he was free from the problems, great and trivial, which every day awaited his decision. Here he needed no protection officer, no vigilant police. Here he could sleep at night with the door unlocked and the windows open to the sky and the sea. Here were no screaming voices, no faces distorted with hate, no post that it could be dangerous to open, no telephone calls threatening his life and the safety of his family. He had arrived yesterday, bringing the minimum necessities and the carefully selected CDs and books, which only on Combe would he have time to listen to and read. He was glad of the cottage's relative isolation, and on the 2 previous visits had spoken to no one for the whole 2 weeks. His food had been delivered according to written instructions, left with the empty canisters and thermos flasks. He had had no wish to join the other visitors for the formal evening meal in the house. The solitude had been a revelation. He had never realized that to be completely alone could be so satisfying and healing. On his first visit he had wondered whether he would be able to endure it, but although the solitude compelled introspection, it was liberating rather than painful. He had returned to the traumas of his professional life, changed in ways he couldn't explain. As on the previous visit, he had left a competent deputy in charge. Home Office regulations required that there should always be a licence holder or deputy licence holder in the laboratory or on call, and his deputy was experienced and reliable. There would be crises, there always were, but he would cope for the 2 weeks. Only in an extreme emergency would his deputy ring Mirlet Cottage. As soon as he had begun unpacking the books, he had found Monica's letter, placed between the 2 top volumes. Now he took it from the desktop and read it again, slowly and with careful attention to every word, as if it held a hidden meaning which only a scrupulous rereading could discern. "Dear Mark, I suppose I should have had the courage to speak to you directly, or at least handed this to you before you left, but I found I couldn't, and perhaps it's just as well. You will be able to read it in peace without needing to pretend you care more than you do, and I shan't feel I have to go on justifying a decision I should have arrived at years ago. When you return from Combe Island, I won't be here. To write about going home to Mother
is humiliatingly pathetic, but that's what I've decided to do, and it is sensible. She has plenty of room, and the children have always enjoyed the old nursery and the garden. As I've decided to end our marriage, it's better to do so before they start secondary education. There's a good local school prepared to take them at short notice, and I know they'll be safe. I can't begin to explain what that will mean to me. I don't think you've ever really understood the terror that I've lived in every day, not just for myself, but for Sophie and Henry. I know you'll never give up your work, and I'm not asking you to. I've always known that the children and I are not in your list of priorities. Well, I have my own priorities. I'm not prepared any longer to sacrifice Sophie, Henry, or myself to your obsession. There's no hurry about an official separation or divorce. I don't much care which. But I suppose we'd better get on with it when you return. I'll send you the name of my solicitor when I've got settled. Please don't bother to reply. Have a restful holiday. Monica. On first reading of the letter, he had been surprised how calmly he had taken her decision. Surprised, too, that he'd had no idea that this was what she had been planning. And it had been planned. She and her mother had been allies. A new school found, and the children prepared for the move. All that had been going on, and he hadn't noticed. He wondered whether his mother-in-law had had a hand in composing the letter. There was something about its matter-of-fact coherence that was more typical of her than of Monica. For a moment he indulged in the fantasy of them sitting side by side, working on a first draft. He was interested, too, that the regret he felt was more for the loss of Sophie and Henry than for the end of the marriage. He felt no strong resentment against his wife, but he wished she had chosen her moment better. She could at least have let him have his holiday without this added worry. But gradually a cold anger began possessing him, as if some noxious substance were being poured into his mind, curdling and destroying his peace, and he knew against whom, with increasing power, it was being directed. It was fortuitous that Nathan Oliver was on the island. Fortuitous, too, that Rupert Maycroft had mentioned the other visitors when he met him on the quay. Now he made a decision. He would change his plans, phone Mrs. Burbridge, the housekeeper, and ask who had booked in for dinner at the house tonight. And if Nathan Oliver were among them, he would break his solitude and be there too. There were things he needed to say to Nathan Oliver. Only by saying them could he assuage this surging anger and bitterness, and return alone to Merlet Cottage to let the island work its mysterious ministry of healing. Book 1, Chapter 6. He was standing with his back to her, looking out of the southern window. When he turned, Miranda saw a face as rigidly lifeless as a mask. Only the pulse beat above the right eye betrayed the bitterness he was struggling to control. She willed her eyes to meet his. What had she been hoping for? A flicker of understanding? Of pity? She said, "We didn't mean you to find out like this." His voice was quiet, his words venomous. "Of course not. No doubt you were planning to explain it all after dinner. I don't need to be told how long the affair has been going on. I knew in San Francisco that you'd at last found someone to fuck. I confess it didn't occur to me that you'd been reduced to making use of Tremlett, a cripple, penniless, my employee. At your age, tupping him in the bushes like a randy schoolgirl is obscene. Were you obliged to take the only available man who offered? Or was it a deliberate choice to inconvenience me? After all, you could have done better. You have certain inducements on offer. You're my daughter. That counts for something. After my death, unless I change my will, you'll be a moderately rich woman. You have useful domestic accomplishments. In these days, when I'm told it's difficult to find, let alone keep, a good cook, your one skill could be an inducement." She had expected this conversation to be difficult, but not like this. Not to be faced with this coruscating anger, this bitterness. Any hope that he might be reasonable, that they might be able to talk things over and plan what could be best for them all, died in a welter of despair. She said, "Daddy, we love each other. We want to get married." She had come inadequately prepared. She knew with a sickening wrench of the heart that she sounded like a querulous child asking for sweets. "Then marry. You're both of age. You don't need my consent. I take it that Tremlett has no legal impediment." And now it all came out in a rush, their impossible schemes, the happy imaginings, which, even as she spoke, seemed small verbal pebbles of hopelessness thrown against his implacable face, his anger and his hatred. "We don't want to leave you. It needn't change anything. I'd come into you by the day. Dennis, too. We could find a reliable woman to take over my part of the house, so that you weren't alone at night. When you're on tour, we could be with you as usual," she said again. "Nothing need change." "So you'd come in by the day? I don't need a daily woman or a night nurse. And if I did, no doubt both can be obtained if the pay is high enough. I take it that you're not complaining of your pay." "You've always been generous." "Or Tremlett of his."
"We didn't talk about money."
"Because you assumed, presumably, that you'd live off me, that life could go on for you as comfortably as it always has." He paused, then stated, "I have no intention of employing a married couple."
"You mean Dennis would have to go?"
"You heard what I said. Since you seem to have talked over your plans and settled my future for me, may I inquire where you intend to live?" Her voice faltered.
"We thought in Dennis's flat."
"Except, of course, that it isn't Tremlett's flat. It's mine. I bought it to house him when he came to me full-time. He rents it furnished on derisory terms under a legal agreement, which gives me the right to terminate the tenancy at a month's notice. Of course he could buy it from me at its present value. I shall have no use for it."
"But the flat must be worth double what you paid for it in 1997.
"That is his and your misfortune." She tried to speak, but couldn't form the words. Anger, and a grief more terrible because she didn't know whether it was for herself or for him, rose like nauseous phlegm in her throat, choking speech. He had turned again to look out of the window. The silence in the room was absolute, but she could detect the rasp of her own breathing, and suddenly, as if the ever-present sound had for a time been silenced, the sonorous murmur of the sea. And then, unexpectedly and disastrously, she swallowed hard and found her voice.
"Are you so sure you can do without us? Don't you really understand how much I do for you when you were on tour? Checking the hotel room, running your bath, complaining on your behalf if the details aren't right, helping to organize the signing sessions, protecting your reputation as the genius who's not too famous to bother about his readers, making sure that you get the food and wine you like. And Dennis, all right, he's your secretary and copy editor, but he's more, isn't he? Why do you boast that your novels don't need editing? That's because he helps edit them, not just copy editing. Editing, tactfully, so you won't have to admit even to yourself how important he is. Plotting isn't your strength, is it? Not in recent years. How many ideas do you owe to Dennis? How often do you use him as a sounding board? Who else would do as much for so little?"
He didn't turn to show her his face, but even with his back to her the words came to her clearly, but not in a voice that she recognized. "You'd better discuss with your lover what exactly you propose to do. If you decide to throw in your lot with Tremlett, the sooner the better. I shall not expect you back at the London house, and I shall be grateful if Tremlett will hand over the keys to the flat as soon as possible. In the meantime, don't speak about this to anyone. Do I make myself clear? Speak to no one. This island is small, but there should be space enough for us to keep out of each other's way for the next 24 hours. After that we can go our separate ways. I'm booked in here for another 10 days. I can take my meals in Combe House. I propose to book the launch for tomorrow afternoon, and I expect you and your lover to be on it."
Book 1, Chapter 7. Maycroft wasn't looking forward to Friday's dinner. He seldom did when any of the visitors had booked in to dine. What caused anxiety was not their eminence, but his responsibility as host to encourage conversation and ensure that the evening was a success. As his wife had frequently pointed out, he was not good at small talk. Inhibited by his lawyer's caution from participating in the most popular chatter, well-informed and slightly salacious gossip, he strove, sometimes desperately, to avoid the banalities of inquiring about the visitors' journeys to Combe or discussing the weather. His guests, all eminent in their different fields, would no doubt have had interesting things to say about their professional lives, which he would have been fascinated to hear. But they had come to Combe to escape from their professional lives. Occasionally there had been good evenings when, discretion put aside, guests had spoken freely and with passion. Usually they got on well. The egregiously rich and famous might not always like each other, but they were at home in the topography of each other's privileged bailiwicks. But he doubted whether his two guests tonight would gain pleasure from each other's company. After Oliver's irruption into his office and his earlier threats, he was horrified by the prospect of entertaining the man through a 3-course meal. And then there was Mark Yelland. This was Yelland's third visit, but he had never before booked in for dinner. There might be perfectly understandable reasons for this, such as the wish for a formal meal, but Maycroft saw it as ominous. After a final adjustment to his tie before the mirror in the hall, he took the lift from his apartment in the central tower down to the library for the usual pre-dinner drinks. Dr. Guy Staveley and his wife Joanna had already arrived, he standing, sherry glass in hand, beside the fire, while Jo had arranged herself elegantly in one of the high-backed armchairs, her glass as yet untouched on the table beside her. She always took trouble over dressing for dinner, particularly after an absence, as if a carefully enhanced femininity was a public demonstration that she was back in residence. Tonight she was wearing a silk trouser suit with narrow trousers and tunic top. The colour was subtle, a pale greenish gold. Helen would have known what colour to call it, even where Jo had bought it and how much it had cost. If Helen had been at his side, the dinner, even with Oliver present, would have held no fear. The door opened, and Mark Yelland appeared. Although guests could order the buggy, he had obviously walked from Merlet Cottage. Taking off his topcoat, he laid it over the back of one of the chairs. It was the first time he had seen Jo Staveley, and Maycroft made the introductions. There were 20 minutes before the dinner gong would sound, but they passed easily enough. Jo, as always in the presence of a good-looking man, exerted herself to be agreeable, and Staveley somehow discovered that he and Yelland had both been at Edinburgh University, although not in residence at the same time. Staveley found enough academic chat, shared experience, and common acquaintances to keep the conversation going. It was nearly 8, and Maycroft began to hope that Oliver had changed his mind, but just as the gong sounded, the door opened and he came in. With a nod and a curt "Good evening" to the company, he took off his coat, placed it beside Yelland's, and joined them at the door. Together they went down the one floor to the dining room immediately below. In the lift, neither Oliver nor Yelland spoke, merely acknowledging each other with a brief nod, like rivals observing the courtesies, but saving words and energy for the contest ahead. As always, there was a menu written in Mrs. Burbridge's elegant hand. They were to begin with melon balls in an orange sauce, with a main course of guinea fowl with roasted vegetables, followed by a lemon soufflé. The first course was already in place. Oliver took up his spoon and fork, and regarded his plate with a frown, as if irritated that anyone should waste time forming melon into balls. The conversation was desultory until Mrs. Plunkett and Milly arrived, wheeling a trolley with a guinea fowl and vegetables. The main course was served. Mark Yelland picked up his knife and fork, but made no move to begin eating. Instead, elbows on table, and knife raised as if it were a weapon, he looked across at Nathan Oliver, and said with dangerous quietness, "I presume that the character of a laboratory director in the novel you're bringing out next year is intended to be me, a character you've been careful to make as arrogant and unfeeling as you could manage, without the man becoming completely incredible." Without raising his eyes from his plate, Oliver said, "Arrogant, unfeeling. If that's your reputation, I suppose some confusion may arise in the public mind. Rest assured there's none in mine. I have never before met you. I don't know you. I have no particular wish to know you. I'm not a plagiarist of life. I only need one living model for my art. Myself."
Yelland put down his knife and fork. His eyes were still on Oliver. "Are you going to deny that you met a junior member of my staff in order to question him about what goes on in my laboratory? I'd like to know, incidentally, how you got hold of his name. Presumably through the animal liberation people, who dangerously disrupt his life and mine. No doubt, impressing him with your reputation, you extracted his views on the validity of the work, how he justified what he was doing, how much the primates were suffering." Oliver said easily, "I undertook necessary research. I wanted to know certain facts about the organization of a laboratory, the staffing levels, the conditions under which the animals are kept, how and what they're fed, how obtained. I ask no questions about personalities. I'm a researcher of facts, not of emotions. I need to know how people act, not how they feel. I know how they feel." "Have you any idea how arrogant that sounds?" "Oh, we can feel all right. I feel for patients with Parkinson's disease and cystic fibrosis. That's why I and my colleagues spend our time trying to find a cure and at some personal sacrifice. I should have thought that the sacrificial victims were the animals. They suffer the pain. You get the glory. Isn't it true that you'd happily see 100 monkeys die, and in some discomfort, if it meant that you published first? The fight for scientific glory is as ruthless as the commercial marketplace. Why pretend otherwise?" Yelland said, "Your concern for animals doesn't much inconvenience your daily life. You seem to be enjoying your guinea fowl. You wear leather. No doubt you'll be taking milk with your coffee. Perhaps you should turn your attention to the ways in which some animals, quite a number, I'm told, are slaughtered for meat. They would die a great deal more comfortably in my lab, I assure you, and with more justification." Oliver was dissecting his guinea fowl with care. "I'm a carnivore. All species prey on each other. That seems to be the law of nature. I could wish we killed our food more humanely, but I eat it without compunction. That seems to me very different from using a primate for experimental purposes, which can't possibly benefit it, on the assumption that Homo sapiens is so intrinsically superior to every other species that we're entitled to exploit them at our will. I understand that the Home Office does monitor the pain levels permissible, and usually seeks detailed clarification on the analgesics being used, and I suppose that's a small alleviation. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not a member or even a supporter of the organizations which inconvenience you. I'm not in a position to be, since I have benefited from past discoveries using animals, and shall certainly take advantage of any future successes. Incidentally, I shouldn't have expected you to be a religious man." Yelland said curtly, "I'm not. I have no supernatural beliefs. You surprise me. I assumed you took an Old Testament view of these matters. You're familiar, I take it, with the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. That's one divine commandment which we've never had difficulty in obeying. Man, the great predator, the supreme exploiter, the arbiter of life and death by divine permission." Maycroft's guinea fowl was tasteless, a gunge in the mouth. This was a disaster, and there was something odd about the dispute. It was less an argument than an antiphonic contest in which only one participant, Yelland, felt genuine passion. Whatever was worrying Oliver, it had nothing to do with Yelland. He saw that Joe's eyes were bright as they moved from one speaker to the other, as if watching an unusually long rally in a game of tennis. Her right hand was crumbling a bread roll, and she fed the pieces unbuttered into her mouth without looking down. He felt that something should be said, but as Staveley sat in increasingly embarrassed silence, he said, "Perhaps we should feel differently if we suffered from a neurological disease, or if a child of ours suffered. Perhaps these are the only people who have the right to speak on the moral validity of these experiments." Oliver said, "I've no wish to speak on their behalf. I didn't begin this argument. I've no strong views one way or the other. My characters have, but that's a different matter." Yelland said, "That's a cop-out. You give them a voice, sometimes a dangerous one. And it's disingenuous to pretend you were only interested in routine background information. The boy told you things he had no right to disclose. I can't control what people choose to tell me. Whatever he told you, he's now regretting it. He's resigned his job. He was one of my most able young men. He's lost to important research and perhaps lost to science altogether. Then perhaps you should doubt the level of his commitment. Incidentally, the scientist in my novel is more sympathetic and complex than you seem to have grasped. Perhaps you didn't read the proofs with sufficient understanding. Or, of course, you may have been imposing your character, or what you fear may be perceived as your character, on my creation. And I would be interested to know how you got your hands on the proofs. Their distribution is tightly controlled by my publisher. Not tightly enough. There are subversives in publishing houses as well as in laboratories. Jo had decided it was time to intervene. She said, I don't think any of us likes using primates for research. Monkeys and chimps are too like us to make it comfortable. Perhaps you should use rats in your experiments. It's difficult to feel much affection for rats. Yelland fixed his gaze on her, as if assessing whether such ignorance deserved a reply. Oliver kept his eyes on his plate. Yelland said, Over 80% of experiments are on rats, and some people do feel affection for them. The researchers do. Jo persisted. All the same, some of the protesters must be motivated by genuine compassion. I don't mean the violent ones who are just getting a kick out of it, but surely some of them genuinely hate cruelty and want to stop it. Yelland added dryly, I find that difficult to believe, since they must know that what they're doing with their violence and intimidation is to force the work out of the United Kingdom. The research will continue, but in countries which haven't our statutory protection for the animals. This country will suffer economically, but the animals will suffer a great deal more. Oliver had finished his guinea fowl. Now he placed his knife and fork carefully side by side on the plate and got to his feet. I think the evening has provided sufficient stimulation. You will excuse me if I leave you now. I have to walk back to Peregrine Cottage. Maycroft half rose from his chair. Shall I order the buggy for you? He knew that his voice was propitiatory, almost servile, and hated himself for it. No, thank you. I'm not yet decrepit. You will, of course, remember that I need the launch tomorrow afternoon. Without a sign to the company, he left the room. Yelland said, I must apologise. I shouldn't have started this. It isn't what I came to Combe for. I didn't know Oliver was on the island until I arrived. Mrs. Plunkett had entered with a tray of soufflés and was beginning to collect their plates. Staveley said, He's in a strange mood. Obviously something's happened to upset him. Jo was the only one eating. She said easily, He lives in a permanent state of being upset. But not like this. And what did he mean by asking for the launch tomorrow? Is he leaving or isn't he? Maycroft said, I profoundly hope he is. He turned to Mark Yelland. Will his latest novel create difficulties for you? It will have its influence, coming from him, and it'll be a gift to the animal liberation movement. My research is seriously at risk, and so is my family. I haven't any doubt that his so-called fictional director will be taken as a portrait of me. I can't sue, of course, and he knows it. Publicity is the last thing I want. He was told things which he had no right to know. Staveley said quietly, But aren't they things we all have a right to know? Not if they're used to jeopardize life-saving research. Not if they get into the hands of ignorant fools. I hope he does intend to leave the island tomorrow. It's certainly not big enough for the two of us. And now, if you'll excuse me, I won't wait for coffee. He crumpled his table napkin, threw it on his plate, and with a nod to Jo, abruptly left. There was a silence, broken by the sound of the lift door. Maycroft said, I'm sorry. That was a disaster. Somehow I should have stopped it. Jo was eating her soufflé with evident enjoyment. Don't keep apologising, Rupert. You're not responsible for everything that goes wrong on this island. Mark Yelland only booked in for dinner because he wanted to confront Nathan, and Nathan played along with it. Get started on the soufflés, they'll go flat. Maycroft and Staveley took up their spoons. Suddenly there was a series of booms like distant gunfire, and the logs in the fireplace flared into life. Joe Staveley said, "It's going to be a windy night."
End of Disc 2.